Good morning. I'm Ed Hanlon, the designated federal officer or DFO for the EPA Science Advisory Board. The designated federal officer or DFO for the EPA Science Advisory Board. At this meeting, the panel will conduct a peer review of the EPA's June 2015 draft panel will conduct a peer review of the potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas on drinking water resources. Assessment of the potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas on drinking water resources. Previously met in person at a public meeting on May 7th and 8th, 2013. Previously met where individual members of the public meeting on May 7th and 8th and engineering comments on where individual members of the panel provided expert science and engineering comments in 2012. Charge questions associated with the research on its hydraulic fracturing December 2012. The panel held a public teleconference on November 20th, 2013, where the panel provided new and emerging information on November 20th, 2013, where the public panel provided new and emerging information. The panel also held a public teleconference on September 30th, 2015. The panel also held a public teleconference on September 30th, 2015, and discussed where the panel received a briefing on EPA's draft assessment report. In response to a request from EPA's Office of Research and Development, or ORD, in response to a request from the SAB conduct research and development of EPA's draft assessment report, our panel will be seeking to identify points of agreement EPA's draft assessment report at this meeting. Our panel will be seeking to identify two members of the panel, Drs. Elaine Fassman and Dawn Kabak, will not be able to participate at this meeting. Two members of the panel, Drs. Elaine Fassman and Dawn Kabak. One member of the panel, Dr. Steve Boland, will be participating via teleconference during one member of the panel, Dr. Steve Boland, will be participating via teleconference. These panel members will be participating with working groups after the panel. After this meeting, panel members will be participating with working groups after the panel. After this meeting, as the SAB is a federal advisory committee empowered by law. The SAB is a Environmental Research Advisory Demonstration Authorization empowered by law. The Environmental Research to provide science advice to the EPA Administrator. The SAB Hydraulic Fracturing to provide science advice panel will develop advice for the EPA. The SAB Hydraulic Fracturing Research Advisory Panel will develop policy. The panel's meetings and deliberations are held as public meetings. Under EPA policy, the panel's meetings and deliberations are held as public meetings that meet the requirements. Discussions of the SAB Hydraulic Fracturing Research Advisory Panel. It's in discussions of the SAB Hydraulic Fracturing Research Advisory Panel conducted in sessions where I, as interactions with the public and ensure that the requirements are conducted in sessions where I, as the DFO, also requires that ensure that the requirements and records of deliberations of the panel. FACA also requires that available the meeting summaries and provide opportunities for public comment. Make publicly available the meeting all materials being discussed at the meeting are available on our SAB website. All materials being discussed at the meeting are available on our SAB website, which is www.epa. The minutes of this meeting are being taken to summarize discussions and action items in accordance. The minutes of this meeting are being taken to summarize discussions and action items in accordance with the requirements of FACA. These minutes will be certified by the panel chair, Dr. David Zombach. 260 sets of unique written public comments have been received today. 260 sets of unique written public comments have been received. 23 members of the public had requested to present oral comments during today's meeting. Also, 23 members of the public most of the panel's members oral comments during today's serving as special government employees. Most of the panel's members already being a regular government serving as special government employees, with one panel member already being a regular government. All panel members are serving as independent scientific and technical experts. All panel members are serving as independent scientific and technical special and regular government employees are subject to federal ethics requirements. Special and regular government employees are subject to federal ethics requirements for serving on FACA compliance with federal ethics laws. I want to inform all at the meeting today. The SAB Staff Office has determined that there are no conflict of interest or appearance of the SAB Staff Office has determined that there are no conflict of interest for any of the SAB Hydraulic Fracturing Partiality issues. For any of the SAB. Final reminder, if you're participating in a meeting using the teleconference line, please remember to final reminder, if you're participating in a meeting using the teleconference line, please remember to mute your line. You would press by pressing *6 so that we do not hear background noise. Also, this entire meeting is being webcast via live audio and visual feed. This entire meeting is being webcast via live audio and visual feed to the public. Instructions on how to connect to the webcast are on our meeting website. Instructions on how to connect Thomas Brennan, Deputy Director of the SAB Staff Office, will now make some opening remarks. Thomas Brennan, Deputy Director of the SAB Staff Office,
good morning, everyone. Like Ed said, my name is Tom Brennan. I'm the Deputy Director of the SAB Staff Office. Good morning, everyone. Like Ed said, my name is Tom Brennan. I'm the Deputy Director of the SAB Staff Office, and I would like to welcome you all to this meeting. A special welcome to the public. Thank you for being here and participating. To the agency representatives here today, and to our esteemed chair and panel, thank you so much for all the effort, all the hard work and commitment to public service. Some of you may remember that Christopher Zarba, who is our SAB Staff Director, was at the last time this meeting was held, which was May 2013. Since then, in October 2014, Chris recused himself from this project, and on that date, I took over his role leading this effort, and I'm here today and will be here through all 3 days of the meeting. This panel is the largest panel that the SAB has ever put together, and I really appreciate the collective breadth of expertise and experience that this group holds, and it really should bring a lot of insight to this peer review process, and thank you all again for your individual commitment to public service on this panel. Members of this panel will seek to develop consensus expert advice and will deliberate after this meeting, not just at the meeting, but beyond, to develop the SAB advisory report in response to the agency's charged questions. I encourage the members of this panel to be open-minded and impartial as they seek to develop consensus expert advisory advice at this meeting. After the meeting, there will be various opportunities for the public to provide continued comments and information as the process goes forward. This panel will be presenting its results to the chartered SAB, and will develop a peer review of this hydraulic fracturing assessment report, and you will have many opportunities to contribute to that process. A summary of these opportunities will be provided on the third day, the final day of this meeting, so before we leave, we will have a discussion of other ways or other opportunities the public has to participate. The SAB will provide notice in the Federal Register and on our SAB website on those opportunities. We want the members of the public to understand how the advisory process works and how they can best provide oral and written input for members' consideration. Information about the advisory process and opportunities for public input will be available at the SAB website. And if you have any questions today during the meeting or afterwards, Ed Hanlon, our designated federal officer, is always a great resource for that information. As Ed mentioned, for this project only, I'm serving as the Deputy Ethics Official, and this panel consists almost entirely of special government employees with one regular government employee. All the members were recruited for this panel based on their individual scientific and technical expertise and not for the organizations they may represent. As the Deputy Ethics Official, I have determined the panel members participating in this meeting have no financial conflict of interest or appearance of lack of impartiality relating to the topic at hand today. Finally, once again, I want to thank you all, public, panel, agency alike, for being here and participating, and I wish you all a productive meeting. And I'll turn it over to Dave, our chair.
Thanks, Tom. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the panel, members of the public. My name is Dave DeZombach. I'm a professor and head of civil and environmental engineering at Carnegie Mellon University, and it's my pleasure and honor to chair this committee. Before we begin, I wanted to mention to everyone in the room, in the event of a fire alarm or other emergency that would require evacuation of the room, we can exit through those doors, go out through the lobby and go out to the front, or there are several other exits here, a little door in the back that goes directly out to the outside the building. Either of these exit doors on the sidewall over here, go out, turn right or left, and there are exits to the outside. And we would reconvene in front of the building in the unlikely event of an emergency of that sort. Well, the first order of business is to introduce our distinguished panel members, and why don't we start over here with Tom Young.
Tom Young, University of California, Davis.
Casey Miller, University of North Carolina.
Bruce Honeyman, Colorado School of Mines.
Peter Bloomfield, North Carolina State University.
Paul Westerhoff, Arizona State University.
Steve Ramke, the University of Kansas.
Joel Dukas, North Carolina State University.
Azrat Ginger, Colorado School of Mines.
Laura Pyrak-Nolte, Purdue University.
Dean Maluda, White Mountain Energy Consulting.
Kathy Enser, Rice University.
Sheridan Norman, Missouri University of Science and Technology.
Tom Davis, Colorado School of Mines.
Beth Boyer, Pennsylvania State University.
John Fontana, Vista Geoscience, Golden, Colorado.
Dan Good, U.S. Geological Survey.
Steve Allman, Fritz Industries.
Susan Brantley, Penn State.
Walt Hufford, Talisman, Mount Repsol.
Scott Bear, Ohio State University.
Jim Sayers, Yale University.
Jim Bruckner, University of Georgia.
Joseph George, Head of Safety Assessment and Merck Pharmaceuticals.
Richard Jack, Thermo Fisher Scientific.
Abby Lee, Exponent.
Joe Ryan, University of Colorado Boulder.
Thanks very much. Thanks to all our panel members for all the work they've done and will be doing and making time for these 3 days of meetings. This is the fourth meeting of the panel, our second in-person meeting as a group, and our task at hand is to conduct a peer review of the EPA Office of Research and Development June 2015 draft report entitled Assessment of the Potential Impacts of Hydraulic Fracturing for Oil and Gas on Drinking Water Resources. The goal for our meeting is to conduct a consensus peer review advisory effort on the draft assessment report, focusing on the scientific, technical, and engineering issues that we identify as a panel, and we will work to seek consensus on points of agreement on responses to specific charge questions. There are 8 specific charge questions for our panel, developed by the Office of Research and Development and in consultation with review by the Science Advisory Board. Our job is to respond to and seek to identify points of agreement and consensus advice on those charge questions, and we will be walking through each of those charge questions over the next 2 days. Since the Office of Research and Development specifically requested a peer review advisory, our panel will seek to develop consensus advice during the meeting, and that will require discussion and some iterations, and the panel's aware of the process for working to achieve consensus, and I'll be providing an overview of that in a moment. In preparation for the meeting, all the panel members have developed preliminary individual written comments, and those are posted on the website for the panel and for this meeting. These comments are individual preliminary responses from the panel members to the charge questions. At this meeting, we will, for each of the charge questions, first have lead discussants, and these folks have been identified and assigned from among the panel here with distribution of duties among the 8 charge questions. Those lead discussants will take between 3 to 5 minutes to provide overview comments associated with the charge question. After we hear from the lead discussants, then I'll provide other panel members an opportunity to provide additional comments, ask clarifying questions, and the like. I may need to cut off discussion at times to keep us on schedule and to give others a chance to speak. And I ask for your understanding. I ask the panel members for understanding in advance. Ed Hanlon and I will be taking notes during the meeting, and that will help us to prepare minutes of the meeting that will be posted on the meeting website after we conclude our discussions. It will take some period of weeks to get those minutes together. They're going to be rather extensive. We will have an opportunity at today's meeting and tomorrow for sessions for oral public comments. Tomorrow will be in the afternoon before we begin our writing session as a panel. We've received 23 requests to present oral comments at the meeting, and that will begin mid-morning today. Members of the public wishing to provide short clarifying comments tomorrow afternoon before we begin our writing session are asked to contact Ed Hamlin, our designated federal officer, in person or by email, hanlon.edward@epa.gov, before noon tomorrow, October 29th. At the end of this meeting on Friday afternoon, I will be summarizing next steps and follow-up panel and SAB activities as we work to develop our report as a panel, our peer review report for transmittal to EPA Office of Research and Development. So that's our plan. And to start us off here, I'm very pleased to welcome, and we're fortunate to have with us today, Dr. Thomas Burke, EPA Science Advisor and Deputy Assistant Administrator for the EPA Office of Research and Development. Dr. Burke will provide some opening remarks, and then Dr. Jeffrey Frisson of the EPA Office of Research and Development will provide us with additional EPA remarks. He'll provide an overview of the project. Dr. Frisson also provide an overview presentation at our panel's teleconference meeting on September 30th, and today's presentation will build on that. On September 30th, we were reviewing the charge questions, and the panel had a number of questions about the charge. The charge was revised slightly in response to that meeting, and today Dr. Frisson will be giving us an overview of the project. I would ask the panel to hold off on questions for Dr. Burke or Dr. Frisson until after their presentations. And so, Dr. Burke, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here. As some of you may know, this is a little bit of a role reversal, and I have such respect for the board, having served with you, Dr. Zombek, and I really appreciate the service of the members of this committee. I know what it takes. I know the commitment that you've made, but I also, now as the science advisor, want to stress the importance of your role. The credibility of our science is absolutely essential, and this review is extremely important to the future of our drinking water resources in the country. And so I want to thank you and want to be in this role as helpful as possible. I will present some opening remarks and then turn it over to my colleague Jeff Frisson to go through the results of the study. So you have before you not a simple document. I challenged them to reduce the pages when I arrived at the agency in January, and they did. So you can thank me a little bit for that. But you have before you this assessment which looks at the potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas on our drinking water resources in the United States. It is a capstone of the agency's study of hydraulic fracturing in drinking water, and this effort has been ongoing since 2010. As you may know, the Science Advisory Board has played an important role in the evolution of this work, helping us get to where we are so far with this product, but really providing throughout the entire process continual evaluation to improve the science as we move forward. The SAB informed the early development of the scope of the drinking water study, reviewed the draft study plan in 2011, and the scope of our draft assessment largely follows the scope that was reviewed and recommended by the SAB. The SAB also provided very important feedback and consultation concerning our 2012 progress report. And now you have before you the draft, and draft is underscored. It continues to be a work in progress, and we value your input. Assessment. As part of this assessment, we feel that we've really moved the science forward. The agency's published 12 technical reports and now 14 peer-reviewed journal articles to provide new insights in the entire water cycle, as you'll see as you review the charge. It represents an integration of the available science and brings together results from the agency's publication, an enormous outreach to stakeholders, including industry, the states, our tribal nations, and others, and data and information from over 950 publications. So this really represents our best presentation of the state of the science, as well as our individual investigations through the water cycle. We feel that it exemplifies the agency's commitment to provide the best available science, analysis, and assessment to address key questions about the potential impacts of fracking for oil and gas on our water resources. Once final, this assessment will give states, tribes, and communities around the country a resource they can use to identify better ways to protect public health and to protect our drinking water. The draft has already had major impacts and enhanced our discussions about hydraulic fracturing at the state level, and certainly advanced the science to stimulate the scientific community. The fracking assessment, as I mentioned, we feel moves the science forward, helping us to better understand the relationship between hydraulic fracturing activities and the nation's drinking water resources. Now, are there gaps? Are there uncertainties? Yes, any scientific investigation has limitations. You might imagine EPA taking on such an enormous task. This was a challenge. This, I feel, in my scientific career, one of the most complex investigations I have ever been a part of. But I think what you have is a synthesis of the best available information, and it will provide the science to move us forward, and also provide, as I mentioned, our states and local health officials and our communities a resource to better protect drinking water. Now, to go over the specifics, I'd like to introduce Jeff Frithson, who will take you through a slide presentation to explain the report and the sequence and the evaluation and major findings. So, Jeff?
Thanks, Tom. And can we go to the presentation? Thank you. Welcome. I'm glad to be here and provide a short overview for you of the major comments, the major findings of our draft assessment. Let's see if this works. Great. As you know, our objectives here are fairly straightforward for a very complex subject. We want to assess the potential for hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas to change the quality or the quantity of drinking water resources in the United States. There's two aspects to this statement. First of all, what kind of impacts are we looking at? We're looking at changes in water quality and water quantity. And the second is how we have defined drinking water. By drinking water, we have taken a fairly broad definition, that being any source of surface water or groundwater that is currently or has the potential in the future to be used as a source of drinking water. Now, the second objective of our study is to look at those factors that affect the severity and the frequency of any of the potential changes that we see in water quality and water quantity. A difficult part of drafting any assessment is looking at the scope and defining what exactly the scope is going to be. As Tom described, what we have set out to do is capture what is known about the impacts of hydraulic fracturing activities on drinking water resources in the United States. We do think that this is an integration and synthesis of the available information on impacts to drinking water. We have brought together material from three main sources. First off, we have brought together the results of our various studies that Tom mentioned, those 12 technical reports and the now 14 journal articles that are out there having to do with various aspects of the water cycle associated with hydraulic fracturing. We've also brought together a very robust literature search. We actually looked at over 3,500 sources of data information, and the assessment itself cites over 950 sources of data and information. And then the third part, because interaction with our stakeholders is so important to the development of any of the assessments that we take on within the agency. We had a very robust outreach, a number of technical roundtables, a very open docket during the development of the assessment itself, where we were taking in whatever information we could glean from industry, the states, non-government organizations, and members of the public. And by the way, that docket remains open to accept input to you, the panel, and to us, the EPA, as we go forth and try to design the changes, the revisions that we might make to the draft assessment. Throughout, we have tried to identify those potential mechanisms whereby hydraulic fracturing activities affects that quality and quantity of drinking water in the United States. And we have also set out to bring together the data that addresses the questions that were first outlined in our study plan. Now, just as it's important to outline what an assessment is, it's also important to outline what an assessment is not. So, first and foremost, this assessment does not look at all aspects having to do with hydraulic fracturing. We are focusing on impacts of drinking water. We're not considering impacts to air, to the land, socioeconomic impacts, and so on. This is not a human health or a human exposure or a risk assessment. It is not site-specific, although we do bring together as much site-specific information as we could get in the scientific literature in order to say something about drinking water and the 5 steps of the water cycle that I will outline shortly. We do not in this report go through and outline best management practices. Neither do we consider management options or policy options, and the assessment itself is not designed to directly inform any specific policy decisions. Now, what we have asked you folks to do is to take a good look at the assessment, and I have to thank you in advance for all of your comments. Those comments are really going to help us bring together and hone the assessment to be the best possible representation of the science as it exists today. We've given you the main report, which is almost 600 pages, and we've given you a big fat appendix of another 400 pages, so you've looked through about 1,000 pages of material, and for that we are ever thankful for your commitment to read through all of those things. Our assessment is focused on following the water. The major part of the scope for the assessment was determined by looking at the flow of water and hydraulic fracturing activities, starting with water acquisition, where one gets the water for hydraulic fracturing, through to the end being where is wastewater from hydraulic fracturing activities disposed of. So the 5 steps have to do with water acquisition, chemical mixing at the well pad, well injection, where there's that actual act of injecting fluids under pressure deep underground to fracture the shales where the oil and gas is trapped, looking at flowback and produced water, and then wastewater treatment and waste disposal. Note a few limitations here. This is not a review of the oil and gas industry. We were trying to look at just hydraulic fracturing activities, not all of the activities associated with oil and gas. Note that the scope is very much follows the water cycle. At the beginning of that, right before water acquisition, we do not deal with site selection for where you place the well pad, for example. At the end of the water cycle, we do not deal with reclamation, site recovery types of things. This is the scope of our project. Let me take a moment here with this diagram to bring out 2 points. Throughout the assessment, we have tried to illustrate a fairly complex subject, and we've tried to do it with various figures or cartoons. These are simplifications of nature, so 2 things to bring out. First off, when we represent geological strata, a lot of our diagrams look like the conventional layer cake that everyone deals with. nature isn't a layer cake. It's often very much more complex, much more folding of geological strata, uplifts, and so on. So please forgive us in our simplification. We are trying to communicate a complex subject to a wide variety of audiences. The second thing to note about our diagrams is that often we show these lenses of underground groundwater resources as solid blue. We almost are portraying these groundwater resources as underground rivers. And that's not the common occurrence with groundwater. What we're dealing with is differences of porosity where the groundwater is mixed with the underlying strata. They're not underground rivers. Again, forgive us for the simplification, but we're trying to portray complex subject matter to a wide range of audiences. Let me step through just ever so briefly some of our major conclusions with each part of the 5 steps of the water cycle. First, with water acquisition. Yes, hydraulic fracturing uses a lot of water. It gets that water from surface water sources, from groundwater sources, and perhaps more significantly now, an increased use of reused wastewaters as a source of fracking fluids. Cumulatively, of course, not all of those are used at any one time, at any one place. There's usually a much smaller number of chemicals that are used for any one operation. There's no single chemical additive that's used at all well sites across the country. There are some things that come out in common, things like methanol, hydrotreated light petroleum distillates, and hydrochloric acid. This is all based upon our analysis of Frac Focus 1.0, by the way. The third step in the water cycle has to do with the well injection stage, and here we're looking at potential subsurface pathways, of which there are 2 types. The first type is the movement of gases or liquids from the wellbore itself into the neighboring drinking water resource, and then the second type of movement would be that movement of gas or liquids from the deeper production zone into the overlying lens of a groundwater resources through the rock formations. The first one deals with well construction and well integrity issues. In general, the characterization of this industry is that there are multiple barriers that act together to prevent the migrations of gases and liquids from the wellbore into the neighboring water resource. Think of multiple casings, think of the cement that's in the annuli and between those casings and that sort of things. Now, those multiple barriers don't always exist. There are instances of inadequate construction, defects or degradation of the cement or casings itself, and these absence of redundancies can create pathways leading to the contamination of drinking water resources. Now, what we don't know here is the specific rates of well integrity failures, and this is one of the data limitations that we have in our report, is that we would have liked to have found more data on well integrity and how well integrity changes over time. In the subsurface, the general thought is that physical separation between the deeper production zone where the oil and gas is, where the shale deposit is, and the surface aquifers, that physical separation as it's larger serves as a way of minimizing impacts through direct communication of fractures. Very often, that separation distance is thousands of feet. There are instances, for example, in the Antrim in Michigan and the New Albany formation, where you're looking at separation distances of hundreds to less than 2,000 feet. Those deep hydraulic fracturing operations are unlikely to create direct flow paths, direct fractures from fracture production zones to shallow water resources. There is, of course, the opportunity for fractures caused by the hydraulic fracturing to intersect with natural fractures in the rock. In some cases, we've noticed that there are instances of fracturing where the production zone itself is co-located with a drinking water resources. Examples of this kind of things are coal bed methane formations. The Wind River Basin in Wyoming is another example. Here's where fracturing is done for the product of interest, gas or oil, right where there is water that can be potentially considered as a drinking water resource. The other thing that we point out in our assessment has to do with well-to-well communication. These are pathways where the fracture network from one well intersects with the fracture network of another well, causing fluid movement. This can cause surface spills. One of the concerns here is the intersection of fracture networks with abandoned wells, or even in some parts of the country, abandoned mines. Now, the fourth part of the hydraulic fracturing water cycle has to do with what comes back out of the well once pressure is released. That is flow back and produced water. The amount of fracturing fluid that's normally returned to the surface is somewhere between 10 and 25% typically, although there's a lot of variation. There are some wells up in the Marcellus that are returning single-digit returns in terms of flowback water. There are some other wells in other parts of the country that can return close to 100% of what was injected down the well. The data on the composition of flowback and produced water are more limited than the data on composition and content of the hydraulic fracturing fluids itself. This is due to there's not a lot of measurements and not a lot of grab samples there, but it's also due to an analytical difficulty that the high total dissolved solid content of produced water presents certain analytical challenges for full characterization of the chemical composition of produced water. Now, in both the stage of chemical mixing and the stage of collecting and managing flowback and produced water, there are the potential for spills, and spills that happen at the site or off-site in between the site and where the water is produced. Those spills can contaminate surface waters, and through infiltration to groundwater can contaminate groundwater resources. Spills of hydraulic fracturing fluids and produced water have indeed occurred throughout the country. In fact, there are hundreds of spills that have been documented. When they occur, sometimes they're immediately cleaned up, sometimes they only reach soil resources, but sometimes they do reach water resources. That total number and the frequency of spills due to hydraulic fracturing activities is largely unknown at the national level. There are some data that we presented in the assessment from the states of Colorado and the states of Pennsylvania, but we don't know how broadly those apply to other states. Most often, the common causes of spills were equipment failure and human error. Some of those spills are just a number of gallons. Some of those spills can be millions of gallons. The last stage in the hydraulic fracturing water cycle has to do with the management, treatment, and disposal of wastewater. And here, when we consider both hydraulic fracturing fluids, what comes back out, flow back, and produced water, hydraulic fracturing does indeed produce large volumes of wastewater. Most hydraulic fracturing wastewaters in the United States are currently disposed of using underground injection control wells, but that practice varies widely geographically. Wastewater reuse also varies geographically. So there's the part of the Barnett that we've tried to characterize where 95% of the wastewaters are disposed of using UIC, and there's about a 5% reuse rate. And then in the Marcellus, we're looking at about 10% of hydraulic fracturing wastewaters that are disposed of using UIC, and about 70% goes to reuse. The other 20% goes to the centralized wastewater treatment facilities that are trying to remove dissolved oils and remove those dissolved solids. Other methods of disposal include evaporation pits, land irrigation, and road spreading, but these are fairly minor. One of the concerns that we bring up in the report is that inadequately treated and discharged wastewaters increases constituent concentrations in receiving waters. Of particular interest is the introduction of halides downstream that present problems for disinfection byproducts when it goes into a drinking water facility and gets chlorinated. Now, along the way, we've tried to do a characterization of the chemicals that are associated with hydraulic fracturing. We put together a database, and we've made that database available online for anyone to use, and the database lists all of our chemicals, and along with that, lists the physical chemical properties of those chemicals, and also lists the toxicological properties of those chemicals. Now, there's two big limitations that we're dealing with in terms of chemistry. One is we don't have a complete list of the chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing, and some of that has to do with disclosure information, for example. So in one or more of the ingredients were claimed as confidential in more than 70% of the disclosures that we looked at in Frac Focus. And about 11% of all ingredient records that were designated as confidential business information. So that list of about 1173 chemicals is not complete, and that's one source of uncertainty. Another source of uncertainty is the information that we have for the chemicals that we do have in the list. For example, when looking at our toxicological properties, we're looking at only about 12% of the chemicals have a human health oral toxicity reference value that could be used in any potential exposure or human health risk assessment should one want to do that. Okay. So to move on and do a few summary slides here. Our assessment identified existing and potential mechanisms and impacts to drinking water resources due to hydraulic fracturing activities as defined by the hydraulic fracturing water cycle. That number of documented impacts to drinking water resources is relatively small relative to the number of fractured wells. Despite the vulnerabilities that we've outlined, those mechanisms whereby hydraulic fracturing activities can and might impact the water quality and water quantity, we find no evidence of a widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources due to hydraulic fracturing activities. Part of our conclusions are, of course, limited by the various sources of uncertainties associated with what we've looked at. One source of uncertainty I think we're all wrestling with is the paucity of long-term systematic studies. I'll reference back to groundwater and those wonderful figures showing groundwater resources move extremely slowly. We're not talking about underground flowing rivers. We could have a spill in the next room and it would take a decade to get into this room, and then might take a few days to get into the room after that. It's the way groundwater works. And to better characterize that, we would need a series of long-term monitoring studies. Another limitation of our assessment is that there's not a lot of pre- and post-fracturing data on the quality of drinking water resources. As scientists, we always want to go out and have a full characterization of what it was before the activity and then what it was after the activity, and we don't have that, a lot of those types of data. Another limitation that we're dealing with is the problem of attributing cause. Causal assessment is an extremely challenging subject for scientists. Causal assessment is not rocket science. It's actually harder. And so one of the things that we are trying to deal with is trying to attribute that cause and effect when someone comes in and says, my well is contaminated, I have methane in my well, or what it is. Can we establish that cause and effect unequivocally, that a hydraulic fracturing activity is related to what is observed in the well? And that is a challenge. Our final challenge is the inaccessibility of some information on hydraulic fracturing activities and potential impacts. This is just the way it is. There are some data that's collected by industry that is proprietary. We can't get at it. There's some data that is collected by industry that is not published. And we're dealing with a scientific publication, and we all want to reference where our data comes from, and that's one of our challenges. Another challenge here is that many of the practices of industry are out there and they have not been documented yet in the literature. There's a lag there, 2 to 4 years, say, between when industry starts to change something and we start to see it in the literature, and I think our assessment reflects that. I'll bring up one subject matter. The amount of the management of water is changing in this industry rapidly. There's a lot more emphasis on water reuse and a lot more attention to considering water not as a waste, but as a resource. And those kinds of things are tough to pick up in the literature thus far. Now, we have served up 8 charge questions for you folks, and we're really looking forward to your comments and your suggestions of how we can make this assessment better. Our charge questions come down to, I think, 4 main points. First off, since we think that this is a representation of the state of the science, we want to make sure that we got all the literature, all the data that's out there, and have we appropriately and accurately summarized that available information. So that's the first part. The second part is, for any assessment, we want it to communicate, we want it to make sure that it has an impact on the communities that are dealing with making our drinking water resources safer. So are the major findings clearly presented, supported by the data and information presented in this assessment? Third, since we're careful scientists, we want to make sure that along the way that we've documented the uncertainties involved and our assumptions and our limitations, are those clearly described? And then fourth, we really would like to hear from you what additional information, background, or context should be added to this assessment to make it better. We have various members of the hydraulic fracturing drinking water assessment team in the audience today. Should the panel have questions along the way about any specific chapter, I'm not going to pretend that I know it all as I sit up here, and I'll call upon the various chapter leads as appropriate to help you all out in your deliberations. And we're all looking forward to those deliberations through the next 3 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Friston, and thank you for your engagement with us on September 30th, too, to go review the charge questions in detail. Thank you, Dr. Berg. I would ask panelists, have any clarifying questions of our guests from the ORD? Okay, seeing none, then I'd like to just walk through our process for today and for tomorrow in terms of the panel's work in addressing the charge questions. There are 8 charge questions that the panel for which the panel will be developing responses during this meeting. Those charge questions are posted on our SAB website. The charge questions are those that were that the EPA ORD requested SAB to address, and we had some engagement with them to clarify the charge questions, and as I mentioned, they were modified a bit following that September 30th teleconference. As noted in the agenda, our panels numbered the charge questions from 1 through 8, and this numbering matches the order of the charge questions that are posted on our website. We will refer to these charge question numbers as we move forward through our discussions during this meeting. During the discussion of each charge question, and we've organized the agenda around the charge questions in sequence, our panel's lead discussants will provide initial lead comments to each question. After the lead discussants provide their comments, other individual members of the panel will offer their thoughts on the charge question. Near the end of the discussion of each charge question, the panel's writing team, the leader of the panel's writing team for that particular charge question will summarize what they heard as areas of consensus and key points. And then we'll have a panel discussion on those areas of consensus and key points before moving on to the next charge question. That will be a preliminary presentation of key points and areas of consensus. The writing teams will be delving more deeply on Thursday afternoon and Friday into identifying areas of consensus and key points. I've asked the panel members when they want to raise a point during discussion to let me know by putting up their nameplate, and I will try to keep track of the order in which the requests are made and call upon folks for comment. And I apologize in advance if I need to cut off discussion to keep us on schedule or to provide others with a chance to speak. Any questions from the panel about our process? Okay, hearing none, I might move to public comments, at least start this.
Yeah, so we're a half an hour ahead of schedule. I have informed every oral public commenter that we might move faster than the agenda, so that's what our plan is, and we're going to move right in particular because we have 23 comments.
Very good. So, yes, if I could ask Dr. Burke and Dr. Friston to maybe move out of there, and we'll have the public commenters come up and sit where Dr. Burke was sitting, and maybe if our meeting logistics folks could move the name tags up there and
Yeah, so we've got some chairs up near the speaker's table for the oral presentations. There's an order listed for our list of oral presenters. We're going to follow that order. Any oral presenters who have PowerPoints or any materials they want to show on the screen should make sure that they've gotten them over to our contractors who are over at that desk with the blue curtain. And we're proceeding as noted on the list of speakers in order.
Okay, we'll wait till we. Okay, let me just a little bit of background here. 260 sets of unique written public comments have been received to date for the panel's consideration at this meeting. Those comments are posted in EPA's docket, and instructions for how to see the comments are provided on the panel's meeting website. We have received 23 requests for presentation of oral comments today. Many of those came in over the last 2 days. We are on a very tight schedule, and we ask members of the public who are presenting to take no longer than 5 minutes. There's a screen up there with a timer for each of the presenters, and we have a screen here, and at 5 minutes, I'll give a 1 minute warning, and at 5 minutes, we'll have to ask you to stop in the interest of fairness to all presenters and maintenance of our schedule. While the SAB is not obligated to respond to public comments received in its deliberations for this review, we've asked members of the panel to review the public comments and to consider points made in public comments as they develop their own comments and advice. It's very important for us to hear public comments, to consider them, and we've provided this additional opportunity today for public presentation. Each member of the public who's presenting slides, and there are a couple of those, please note which page number you are on in your presentation so that folks on the teleconference line can follow you. And each member of the public who's presenting slides or video should be aware that the webcast of their presentation will be whatever is being shown on the presentation screen. So this entire proceedings today is being live streamed via webcast. And with that, I'll ask Ms. Tatham to come forward. Up in the front where Dr. Burke was sitting.
I am Elizabeth Tatham, 79 Old Mill Lane, Holland, Pennsylvania. I am speaking as a stakeholder from Pennsylvania. People in the United States and around the world have waited 5 years to get scientific findings from this EPA study, but the results are disappointing. The EPA assessment has been limited by lack of actual water testing and lack of quantifying the occurrence and severity of many important issues associated with fracking. For instance, we don't learn the occurrence of earthquakes for their severity. How many explosions, catastrophic fires, and severe spills have occurred? We have had numerous such incidents in Pennsylvania alone. The number of wells and water systems affected by pollutants, etc. The EPA assessment does not include data on health-related impacts. I will read from the introduction of the third edition of the Compendium on Health Harms and Risks of Fracking, published October 14, 2015, by concerned health professionals of New York and Physicians for Social Responsibility. As this unconventional extraction method has pushed into more densely populated areas of the United States, as fracking operations have increased in frequency and intensity, and as the transport of extracted materials has expanded, a significant body of evidence has emerged to demonstrate that these activities are dangerous to people and their communities in ways that are difficult and may prove impossible to mitigate. Risks include earthquakes and adverse impacts on water, air, agriculture, public health and safety, property values, climate stability, and economic vitality. It is therefore critical that the three studies EPA had in progress in 2012 in Dimock, Pennsylvania, Pavilion, Wyoming, and Parker County, Texas, be reopened and continued to completion. The investigations in Wyoming and Texas were turned over to the drilling companies by EPA, and the Dimock study was just suddenly stopped. In April 2010, Pennsylvania DEP gave the gas company drilling in Dimock a large fine and ordered them to shut down 3 gas wells for contaminating 18 water wells. Later studies there by EPA, scientists from Duke University, the National Resources Defense Council, and others were discounted, even though they showed extensive methane in water, wells, arsenic, etc. EPA had planned to test 62 wells before the study was stopped in 2012, and affected families had to start paying for their own clean water. Most signed non-disclosure agreements to get the company to provide it free. In Pavilion, EPA's investigation showed aquifer and well water contamination that was later verified by U.S. Geological Survey. The November 11, 2011 ProPublica article titled EPA Finds Compound Used in Fracking in Wyoming Aquifer describes EPA water test results that were consistent with water samples the EPA collected from at least 42 homes in the area since 2008, when ProPublica began reporting on foul water and health concerns in Pavilion. The EPA study in Parker County, Texas, also needs to be resumed and expanded, since numerous well owners near the Lipsky well have reported contaminated water to regulators since 2012. The Associated Press article, New Tests Find More Methane in North Texas Water, published by Bloomberg in January 2014, states, Texas Oil and Gas Regulator has opened a new investigation into allegations that methane is contaminating North Texas water after residents complained that independent sampling by university researchers revealed high levels of the explosive gas in their residential wells. The agency and scientists said, the December 20, 2013 EPA Inspector General's response to a congressional inquiry about the Parker County site states, quote, the EPA used its discretion in withdrawing the emergency order. The EPA reached an agreement whereby the company agreed to test 20 water wells every 3 months for a year to provide information about the presence of more widespread contamination.
Ms. Latham, your time is...
According to the EPA, the sampling, however, the EPA lacks quality assurance and information for the company's sampling program, and questions remain about the contamination.
Ms. Latham, your time has expired.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Ms. Carluccio.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment here today. Delaware Riverkeeper Network is presenting testimony to emphasize concerns included in our written comments submitted in August. EPA should not issue a final assessment based on this draft assessment. We ask the EPA instead to start over with a more inclusive scope to include all necessary data and on-the-ground studies that would provide the information needed for an accurate and reliable assessment. We see two key areas of failure in the draft assessment. First, the environmental impacts of hydraulic fracturing are ignored. Second, EPA's reliance on poorly documented information, industry-supplied information, and the use of built-in but unjustified assumptions plague the credibility of this draft assessment. This testimony will provide additional data on these two areas of failure. First, the environmental impacts of fracking are ignored in the draft assessment. Only drinking water effects are assessed, and an erroneous conclusion was reached as a result of this. How the impacts to water supplies were measured is extremely limited, and the parameters unjustified. We agree that water supply impacts are crucial, but the draft assessment fails to meet the charge given by Congress because EPA narrowed its scope, turning a blind eye to the watershed environment that defines the water quality of water resources, which has resulted in this fatally flawed review. How did this happen? EPA acknowledges that too little of what happens underground is actually known. Therefore, it should require extensive groundwater monitoring to detect contamination of aquifers, and then undertake a data-intense assessment before issuing any conclusions about potential or occurring impacts. EPA concludes that fracking causes no widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources in the U.S., while at the same time acknowledging they do not have the data to support this conclusion. EPA did not actually analyze for such impacts. In fact, EPA abandoned on-the-ground case studies in Wyoming, Texas, and Pennsylvania, and did not conduct its own planned test site in the Marcellus. EPA did not conduct complex analysis of robust data sets. EPA did very little pre- and post-fracking water quality data and admits that that is inaccessible. Few long-term systemic studies have been done, according to EPA, and much of the needed information is inaccessible because it's considered proprietary and sealed in litigation settlements. So where does that leave us without the needed data? EPA has reached a falsely broad conclusion because it states it did not consider all the aspects of fracking and therefore had a narrow scope. But EPA should know that a review by Dr. Anthony Ingraffia and his organization of 580 peer-reviewed science publications in the actual impacts of shale gas development reveals that 94% find harmful impacts to human health, 69% find harmful impacts on water quality, and 88% find harmful impacts to air quality. The scope must be broadened. What EPA did examine was far too limited to be reliable, which leads me to our second failing. EPA's reliance on poorly documented information, industry-supplied information, and the use of built-in but unjustified assumptions plagued the credibility of this draft assessment. Why? EPA accepted industry statistics without critique. EPA and the industry relies on the distance between the target formation and shallow groundwater to protect that groundwater, despite the fact that in some areas fracking occurs very near the base of shallow aquifers or in parts of aquifers, admitted here today. EPA assumes few out-of-formation fractures occur, but offers absolutely no data to support this. Out-of-formation fractures provide pathways to fracking fluid to leave the target formation and reach formations closer to shallow groundwater and more transmissive formations, increasing the potential pathways to groundwater. EPA fails to consider effects from the fracking of multiple wells, including changes in permeability over large areas and changing groundwater flow, including allowing large-scale brine movement upward toward the shallow aquifer. EPA does not address problems with groundwater contamination from wells that undergo fracking for a second time, which is more and more prevalent. Marcellus Shale contains naturally occurring radioactive material at concentrations much higher than at background at the Earth's surface. In Pennsylvania, for instance, radium-226 concentrations in unfiltered brine samples were elevated, ranging from 40.5 to 26,600 picocuries per liter, compared to the drinking water standard of 5 picocuries per liter. EPA has the authority to regulate all naturally occurring radioactive materials, yet the agency does not examine or acknowledge the dangers of not knowing the ultimate disposition of these hazardous radioactive materials being brought to the surface by fracking. Some dangerous constituents...
Ms. Carlucci, your time has expired.
Yes, sir. Some dangerous constituents in fracking wastewater, such as strontium, are not easily removed by existing treatment systems, and some, such as bromide, are also not easily removed by water treatment
Ms.
facilities.
Carlucci, I'll have to ask you to stop there. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Carlucci. In fairness to others, I'll have to ask you to stop there. Thank you, Ms. Carlucci. For all public commenters, there's a big clock right next to you up there. Please keep an eye on that as you comment. Next, we have Ms. Carty.
Good morning. I'm Susan Carty, the president of the Pennsylvania League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters has a long history of conducting research, examining issues from various perspectives, and reaching positions based on consensus. Advocacy based on these positions is an important part of the League activity. These comments today are presented on behalf of the League of Women Voters of the United States and 35 other state signatories. As hydraulic fracturing has expanded throughout our country, communities have been forced to make decisions without access to reliable information about the potential risks to health, safety, and the environment. The research reported in this draft is not the comprehensive and definitive study that Congress funded in 2010. The League requests that the Hydraulic Fracturing Research Advisory Panel urge the SAB to restore integrity to the final report and to your legacies by taking the following steps. 1. Broaden the scope of the report to include impacts to surface and groundwater so that the conclusions about systemic impacts on drinking water resources can reasonably be drawn. 2. The EPA, in consultation with the CDC and other federal public health agencies, should do all in its power to make information available to health professionals and the public about carcinogenic and otherwise highly toxic chemicals that are frequently used in or emitted by fracking-related processes. 3. Conduct the 2 prospective studies comprising baseline and ongoing analysis of groundwater by independent certified laboratories for at least 2 years, as Congress and the public had anticipated. 4. Reopen the study sites in Dimock, Pennsylvania, Pavilion, Wyoming, and Parker County, Texas, that were prematurely shut down in 2012, even though there were strong indications of extensive contamination of drinking water. 5. Do not allow the scope of your research to be limited to voluntary disclosures compiled from the industry-supported FRAC-focused database. 6. Recommend lifting the exemption from the State Drinking Water Act and other federal laws so that the public can know what is being injected into the ground. 7. Make available federal record-keeping systems that will help states monitor A. Health outcomes for people, especially young children, near fracking operations. B. Spills, explosions, fires, and other accidents associated with fracking. C. Waste production and disposal, including solid waste, flowback, and produced water. D. Radioactivity of ground and surface water exposed to solid and liquid waste. E. Earthquakes associated with deep water waste injection wells and the damage they cause. E. Earthquakes, F. Flooding of waste impoundments and leaking liners. 8. Please utilize studies and reports done by USGS, NOAA, and other federal agencies. 9. Assess the impact of directional drilling on groundwater contamination. 10 or more wells are fracked in succession from a single borehole with lines going in different directions and line intersections are possible. 10, directly measure the levels of toxic fracturing chemicals in drinking water intakes in watersheds where there have been high concentrations of fracturing operations. Despite the limitations on disclosure allowed under the 2005 National Energy Act, chemicals identified as being used in fracturing formulations include some that have, quote, potential for carcinogenesis, immune system effects, changes in body weight, changes in blood chemistry, cardiotoxicity, neurotoxicity, liver and kidney toxicity, and reproductive and developmental toxicity. Public safety requires some understanding of the cumulative effects and levels of these toxins. 11, make regular measurements of bromate concentrations in treated water for all watersheds that have seen moderate to high levels of fracking. The studies listed in this report, as well as others, suggest that this can be a significant problem in public water supplies. Although we are pleased that the EPA has recently proposed to regulate methane leaks from new wells, well casings and caps of previously drilled wells are also subject to significant methane leaks that can potentially contaminate the groundwater. Even when casings are initially sound and prevent leaks, the cement will shrink as the curing process continues and cracks will propagate during the following days and months. The cements used are unstable under use conditions, and cracks will be further propagated in sealed and abandoned wells as decades pass, eventually causing failure and leakage. Therefore, all sealed and abandoned wells as decades pass eventually do cause leakage, and therefore wellheads need to be properly recorded and their status tracked on a regular basis. EPA should require the safeguard.
Ms. Carter, your time's expired.
We thank you very much and appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you. Okay, next we have Mr. Knoll.
Good morning, everyone. My name is John Noel, and I am the National Oil and Gas Campaigns Coordinator for Clean Water Action. I appreciate the opportunity to submit this statement on behalf of Clean Water Action. We also submitted technical comments to the docket with the Natural Resources Defense Council. EPA's study design was appropriate given the constrained resources, and the results identified dozens of vulnerabilities throughout the hydraulic fracturing life cycle. The findings of this assessment can greatly inform our understanding of the impacts of a hydraulic fracturing activity in order to support updating protections where necessary. The panel should recommend EPA add a section specifically dedicated to the heightened threats that wastewater disposal in pits poses to drinking water resources in light of new information from the Groundwater Protection Council, California Council on Science and Technology, and a report earlier this year from Clean Water Action. The panel should recommend EPA add a section discussing the prospective case studies and any plans to resume this work. The prospective case studies featured in the 2011 final study plan and again in the 2012 progress report were a highly anticipated aspect of EPA's research plan. Yet in this assessment, there is zero mention of the case study results or future plans. Given the intense public interest in this area, EPA has an obligation to explain exactly why this work was not completed and if it was due to non-cooperation from the industry. Revise executive summary to accurately convey the findings of the assessment. The executive summary does not faithfully summarize the results of the study. The statement, quote, "We did not find evidence that these mechanisms have led to widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources in the United States," end quote, misrepresents the level of certainty with which the EPA can identify impacts to drinking water. And the subsequent statement, quote, "The number of identified cases, however, was small compared to the number of hydraulically fractured wells," end quote, implies EPA systematically investigated the water quality near every single hydraulic fractured well, which it did not claim to do even for a statistically significant sample of wells. And elsewhere in the assessment, EPA indicates there is no definitive count or location of every hydraulically fractured well. This is misleading for anyone who does not read the full findings contained in the lengthy chapters of the assessment. The body of the report outlines vulnerabilities in every stage of the water life cycle, but importantly, it places greater emphasis on EPA's inability to determine with any certainty the frequency of impacts due to a lack of available data. There are dozens of instances in the assessment where EPA reveals a lack of available data, which could lead to undervaluing threats to drinking water. One key phrase is found in the synthesis chapter It's a long quote, I'll read the end. Quote, in particular, data limitations preclude a determination of the frequency of impacts with any certainty. There is a high degree of uncertainty about whether the relatively few instances of impacts noted in this report are the result of a rarity of effects or a lack of data, end quote. This statement focuses on the uncertainty inherent in drawing any firm conclusions about hydraulic fracturing impacts on drinking water resources. Unfortunately, this is also the point that is lost in the major findings section of the executive summary. Again, we believe this is misleading to the general public and to journalists reporting on the assessment's initial release. A quick LexisNexis search for EPA hydraulic fracturing or EPA fracking during the 2 weeks after the assessment for me yielded 27 results, the majority of which interpreted the report to be a positive assessment of hydraulic fracturing, and almost every press release or article cited the summary sentence, quote, we did not find evidence that these mechanisms have led to widespread systemic impacts on drinking water. A couple of examples of the headlines, quote, EPA fracking has no widespread impact on drinking water. EPA review clears fracking. No water contamination problems yet from fracking. API said EPA hydraulic fracturing review confirms safety. Wall Street Journal, quote, the EPA fracking miracle. In sum, in order to avoid the assessment, having the assessment's findings misunderstood or intentionally misconstrued, the high-level conclusions must be supported by the underlying data. We request that EPA revise the major findings and conclusions sections of the executive summary to make it clear that EPA cannot with any certainty say how widespread or systemic the impacts of hydraulic fracturing are due to the lack of available data and due to the fact that EPA did not perform a statistical analysis of the number of cases of drinking water impacted by fracturing activities versus the number of fracturing activities. Thank you for the opportunity to submit these comments.
Thank you, Mr. Knoll.
Under time.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we'll take one more speaker and then we'll go to a break. Next is Ms. Saunders.
Members of the Advisory Board, my name is Nicole Saunders and I represent the Environmental Defense Fund. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comment today. EDF appreciates the time and effort EPA clearly put into compiling a valuable cumulative synthesis of data and information available to date within the scope of this important review. However, EDF is concerned that EPA has failed to appropriately recognize and address how the large number of unknowns, uncertainties, and limitations in this report qualify the agency's widely cited and often miscited conclusion that the agency did not find evidence that hydraulic fracturing activities have led to widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources. This major finding is unclear at best and misleading at worst. Congress did not require EPA to reach a final national conclusion on this subject, but rather to study it and to improve our understanding. What I'm here to share with the board today is that EPA has successfully done just that, but has failed in providing meaningful messaging on its efforts. EDF asks that this board urge EPA to revise its main finding to more clearly and accurately represent the body of the report. If this assessment supports any broad conclusion, it is that the agency does not at this time have adequate information to make a definitive statement regarding widespread systemic impacts of hydraulic fracturing activities. The conclusion as written is vague, flawed in its reasoning, a misrepresentation of the full content of the report, and has the potential to significantly misdirect much-needed research and policymaking. Simply put, the cover doesn't match the content, and this board could correct that error. EPA's reasoning that the number of identified cases was small compared to the number of hydraulically fractured wells is an oversimplified representation of the facts that creates more questions than it answers about what this finding means. For example, were there adequate data to scientifically and accurately represent the number of identified cases with confidence? What is the statistical significance of small? And perhaps most importantly, how does this conclusion incorporate the severity of individual impacts? EPA encountered obvious difficulties in identifying and quantifying the existence, frequency, and severity of impacts in the face of acknowledged data gaps, limitations, and uncertainties. Formulating this result, or lack of results, into an overall finding that there is a lack of evidence of widespread systemic impacts is a misleading mischaracterization of the facts. Spills are a good example. EPA could estimate spill rates for only 2 states. How was a virtually unknown spill rate accounted for in the overall finding that spills have not led to widespread systemic impacts? Of the 1,076 chemicals listed as used or detected in the hydraulic fracturing water cycle, EPA could identify physiochemical properties for less than 50% and could present key chronic toxicity information for only 13%. How can we truly understand the potential severity of a spill impact without this vital information on the character of the waste spilled? Fundamental data gaps like this are not well represented in EPA's major finding, and similar key unknowns are present in every chapter of this report. The mere presence of unknowns, uncertainties, and limitations, however, is not the issue. EPA's main concern, EDF's main concern, lies in the manner in which key data gaps, uncertainties, and research needs, despite their acknowledgement, have been overshadowed both in the report and in public dialogue by the seemingly inconsistent finding that EPA has not found evidence of widespread systemic impacts. As written, this finding could misdirect future scientific research and policymaking, both in the U.S. and internationally, negating the time and effort EPA devoted to compiling this highly influential scientific assessment and potentially impeding forward progress in addressing the very real vulnerabilities and uncertainties highlighted. EDF believes that every impact, even if not widespread or systemic, matters, especially if there was a missed opportunity to avoid that impact through informed advancements in science, technology, industry practices, or regulation. And this report lacks clear direction from EPA on the advancements needed to address the key vulnerabilities and uncertainties presented. So, in closing, while EPA may not at this time possess adequate information to make a conclusive statement regarding widespread systemic impacts of hydraulic fracturing, EPA does have ample information to use this assessment to more clearly highlight and define the scientific and technical data needed to support more definitive answers in the future. EDF respectfully urges this board to encourage it to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, it's 10:25. We'll take a break until 10:40, at which point we will continue with public comments.
Marcellus Shale since this activity began in the Commonwealth. In 2012, SEAT led the formation of an inter-centre working group on hydraulic fracturing comprising of 16 of the 20 of the Environmental Health Sciences core centres in the nation. The working group submitted written comments to the SAB on their draft assessment in August, which we would like to be part of the public record. These comments address concerns relating to each chapter of the draft risk assessment and will not be revisited here. I will make a general comment and then focus on wastewater management in the Marcellus Shale region. These views are not those of the National Institute of Environmental Sciences, but the views of SEAT investigators who have examined these issues. General comments. EPA states in their draft assessment that they found specific instances where drinking water resources were contaminated, but this was neither widespread nor systematic. The EPA acknowledges that significant gaps exist in knowledge. These deficiencies include a lack of pre- and post-fracturing water quality data and knowledge of the composition of the hydraulic fracturing fluid itself due to confidential business information. The lack of such data makes it difficult to attribute water contamination or absence thereof to the hydraulic fracturing process. Based on this significant data gap, the EPA does not have sufficient analytical data to claim that water contamination was neither widespread nor systematic. The EPA states that its draft assessment will not be used to set federal regulatory policy. However, it's highly likely that it will be used by policymakers to justify a no-action policy. We believe that the executive summary should be modified to read: the EPA found specific instances where drinking water was contaminated. This was not widespread nor systematic, but since there was a lack of baseline water quality data and complete disclosure of the composition of the hydraulic fracturing fluid, we find that the potential for a broader impact on drinking water resources may exist. I will now deal with wastewater management. Wastewater management in Pennsylvania is a major concern since there's a dearth of deep injection wells for wastewater disposal. Of the 73 centralized water treatment (CWT) facilities in the US identified by the EPA that treat hydraulic fracturing wastewater, 39 are located in Pennsylvania. Of these, 30 are zero discharge facilities. However, the 9 non-zero discharge facilities handle 42% of the waste. Since the constituents of the wastewater may contain proprietary chemicals, it is not feasible to determine the effectiveness of non-zero discharge CWT facilities in treating this waste. Because of the large volumes of wastewater processed, it's incumbent upon the EPA to establish that discharge CWTs are effective in removing all contaminants. This can only take place if there is full disclosure of the composition of the hydraulic fracturing fluid to either the EPA or a state regulatory authority. Figure 1 charts how the production of liquid waste has increased annually over the last 5 years due to saturating drilling now occurring in Susquehanna County. Figure 2 illustrates that a single CWT facility processes liquid waste from many unconventional wells, green dots with red lines, in Susquehanna County shown with a blue star, and neighboring counties. The red dots represent other CWT facilities that also receive liquid waste, emphasizing the magnitude of wastewater transportation and potential exposure to this waste. The EPA report states that bromide and iodides are precursors of disinfection byproducts that can form the presence of organic carbon in wastewater treatment plants. One common DPB is trihalomethane. EPA's own funded research determined that prolonged exposure to trihalomethanes can cause several types of cancer in mice, and a similar mode of action exists in humans. For this reason, the EPA developed service water quality standards based on designated uses of waste receiving waters. The report does not indicate if any of the receiving waters of the shale waste were impaired and require a total maximum daily load to be enforced. Pennsylvania is a state in which EPA has granted primacy to comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act, but the state is only now considering regulations on the construction of holding ponds for wastewater under revisions to Act 13. While we can see that the use of these holding ponds is on the decline in Pennsylvania, by failing to act, the EPA allowed the state primacy for enforcement of the Safe Drinking Water Act to be compromised. The EPA should state that the potential for contamination of drinking water resources exists from wastewater management in the absence of stricter regulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Penning. Our next speaker is Mr. Carpenter.
Good morning. AWW applauds EPA's efforts in conducting this assessment and the efforts of the Science Advisory Board to review this study's material. AWWA also appreciates today's comment period as an additional opportunity to share our concerns on the assessment as provided officially and in more detail in our written comments dated August 28, 2015. And the comments included below are only a selection of the concerns described there. For those of you not familiar with AWWA, we are an international, nonprofit, scientific and educational society dedicated to providing total water solutions, assuring the effective management of water. Our membership includes approximately 4,000 drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and water reuse utilities, and a total of 50,000 water professionals. EPA asserts that the evidence of impacts of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water resources is not widespread or systemic. However, even rare impacts are significant when and where they occur, and technical and policy discussions to reduce both the incidence and consequence of rare impacts is still extremely important to drinking water resources. Protection of drinking water requires a very long view, looking at least 10, 20, or often many more years into the future. We recommend the EPA provide more analysis of the consequence of rare events. For example, we believe the EPA should better characterize, or if not able to, at least clearly list as a research need, the fate of well casings over time, issues surrounding both proper and improper abandonment of wells, and stormwater and water quality impacts of these activities during routine operations. EPA's study plan did not include an analysis of the impacts of wastewater injection through the Underground Injection Control Program. Impacts, if any, remain unclear, and we recommend that EPA pursue research on this topic and clearly identify it as a research gap in this assessment. EPA's study plan for this assessment also did not include an analysis of the potential for induced seismicity, either from fracturing itself or from wastewater disposal through injection. Evidence of the potential for induced seismicity continues to mount and could impact water resources such as aqueducts and treatment facilities. We encourage EPA to prioritize this research and clearly identify it as a gap in this assessment. Many groups have discussed the potential for unique tracer or fingerprint substances that could be easily distinguished from naturally occurring substances to serve as an early warning for potential contamination events. The feasibility of such systems remains unclear, and we believe that assessing the feasibility and potential usefulness of such systems is worth exploring, and doing so should be identified as a research gap for future work. Thank you for the opportunity to provide these comments.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. Our next speaker is Mr. Zimmerman.
Good morning. My name is Jeff Zimmerman. I'm speaking today on behalf of three grassroots environmental organizations: Damascus Citizens for Sustainability, NYH2O, and Citizens for Water. All three are concerned with the public health and environmental impacts of unconventional oil and gas development using slickwater high-volume hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking. We appreciate this opportunity to share our comments and perspectives on the external review draft. In written comments submitted to EPA on August 28th, we took issue with the conclusion expressed in the executive summary that this study team did not find widespread systemic impacts of hydraulic fracturing mechanisms on drinking water sources. This draft report did find instances of drinking water resource contamination from fracking, but concluded that the number of impact cases was small compared to the number of hydraulically fractured wells nationwide. With all due respect, that wasn't the charge to this organization or to EPA. We wouldn't accept a 6 to 10% failure rate in car driving, airplane flying, or any other mode of transportation or interaction we have. We don't even accept that with our computers. Why should we accept that in this situation and say, oh, just because it was only 10%, we don't care about the impact? We ask you to take a careful look at the compendium published in October of this year by the Concerned Health Professionals of New York and Physicians for Social Responsibility, the third edition of the Compendium of Scientific, Medical, and Media Findings demonstrating risks and harms of fracking. Pay special attention to the first 7 pages of this compendium that include the foreword, the introduction, and the about this report portions of the compendium. I'll provide a written copy of this testimony with a link to the compendium so you can easily retrieve it. As more and more information is reported, the body of evidence of adverse drinking water resource impacts continues to mount up on an accelerating basis. But this advisory panel needs to review more than a collection of scientific articles and reports. This panel also needs to learn firsthand from some of the individual citizens and families who've had their lives destroyed by fracking. On several occasions at prior meetings of this panel, we and others have urged EPA to include in its investigation information from 3 well-known and extensively documented fracking impact cases, namely Dimmock, Pennsylvania, Pavilion, Wyoming, and Parker County, Texas. We are fortunate today to have individuals from each of these, shall I say, notorious cases here to share with their personal stories about the impact of fracking on them and their families. As you listen to them, we ask you to try to put yourself in their shoes and consider how you would cope if that was happening to you. Thank you for this opportunity to present our remarks.
Our next speaker is Mr. Horwitt.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment. My name is Dusty Horwit. I'm Senior Counsel with Partnership for Policy Integrity, a nonprofit organization that provides science and legal support so that citizen groups, environmental organizations, and policymakers can better understand energy development impacts. We have already submitted detailed written comments on the EPA's draft and will be making brief remarks today. While EPA's draft study contains valuable information about hydraulic fracturing and risks to drinking water, the study falls short in at least two significant ways. First, the EPA's widely quoted conclusion in the executive summary about how the agency did not find evidence of, quote, widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources, unquote, is highly misleading. The statement implies that while evidence might come to light pointing to a different conclusion, the available data allowed EPA to make this judgment. The agency's news release went even further, omitting the word evidence and stating that, quote, hydraulic fracturing activities have not led to widespread systemic impacts to drinking water resources, unquote, as if the issue were settled. However, the body of the report highlights so many data gaps, no reasonable scientist could have drawn a conclusion about how widespread or systemic the impacts were. For example, the agency writes on page 6-57 of the chapter on well injection that, quote, the limited amount of information hinders our ability to evaluate whether or how frequently drinking water impacts are occurring, or the potential for these impacts to occur, or to tie the possible impacts to specific well construction, operation, or maintenance practices. This also significantly limits our ability to evaluate the aggregate potential for hydraulic fracturing operations to affect drinking water resources, or to identify the potential cause of drinking water contamination or suspected contamination in areas where hydraulic fracturing occurs, unquote. Similarly, on page 9-35 of the chapter on chemicals used in the fracking cycle, EPA writes, quote, major knowledge gaps exist regarding the toxicity of most chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing fluids or detected in flowback produced water, impeding the assessment of human health risks associated with drinking water resources affected by hydraulic fracturing. We have included many other examples in our detailed written comments previously submitted. When EPA issues conclusions in a news release and executive summary that the agency knows will be widely read, and then includes a contradictory set of findings in the body of a 1,000-page report that the agency knows will be subject to far less scrutiny, it makes it look as if the agency is intentionally misrepresenting its research. In its final report, EPA should state simply that there is not enough research to evaluate how widespread or systemic impacts to drinking water are, if indeed the data continue to support that conclusion. Second, while we commend the agency for taking a broad view of hydraulic fracturing from acquisition of water resources to disposal of wastewater, a close reading of the report reveals that this approach is much less than advertised. The agency finds that underground injection of often toxic fracking wastewater predominates in most regions as the disposal method, and that such injections likely comprise billions of gallons per year. In the 1987 report to Congress, EPA provided several examples of groundwater contamination from injection disposal wells and explained how such contamination might occur. Other government agencies and news outlets have also found serious contamination from such injections. Yet EPA explicitly and without explanation omitted study of the risk to drinking water from this predominant disposal method while analyzing risks from other waste disposal practices. This decision appears arbitrary and will tend to leave the public uninformed about a serious risk to drinking water. Risk to drinking water from underground injections should be included in the final report. Similarly, in this assessment of leaks and spills, EPA reported that it winnowed a data set of 36,000 such incidents, apparently in oil and gas operations generally, to just 457 spills occurring on or near the well pad before or during the injection of hydraulic fracturing fluids or during post-injection recovery of fluids. This methodology excludes spills inherently related to hydraulic fracturing, including those that occur during the transport of chemicals or wastewater to and from well sites, even if they happen 1 foot off the well pad. Spills of fluids required to drill a well prior to fracking, and spills on or off the well pad of diesel fuel that is required to operate machinery for hydraulic fracturing. Such spills and leaks should be included in the final report. EPA also omits analysis of whether chemicals used in the drilling process might migrate into underground aquifers. Drilling a well must precede hydraulic fracturing and is an inherent part of the process. Therefore, risks of underground migration of drilling fluids should be included, especially because, as EPA implies, drilling can pass through groundwater before any casing or cement can be installed that would seal off groundwater from chemicals. In general, in determining the study scope, EPA should ask, if a decision is made to use hydraulic fracturing, what risks to drinking water will occur?
Mr. Horwitz, your time has expired.
The agency should be more rather than less inclusive in its answer so that citizens and policymakers can have as clear an understanding as possible about the risks.
Thank you, Mr. Horwitz. Our next speaker is Mr. Minsis.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to submit comments today for the Environmental Protection Agency's assessment of potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas on drinking water resources. My name is Aaron Minces. I'm with Earthworks. Earthworks is a national organization that protects communities and the environment from the impacts of energy development while seeking sustainable solutions. I have just two very general observations I would like to make about the report as a whole, and then one specific observation I would like to make with respect to charge question 5D, which this board will consider later on this week. To the general observations, first of all, we believe that the unequivocal conclusion from this report is that hydraulic fracturing contaminates drinking water resources. You're going to hear from my friends from Dimmick and Parker County, Texas, and Pavilion, Wyoming. Their stories are not just anecdotal. The EPA did investigations there. Those investigations, the science contained in this report, demonstrate that contamination, not only that there's contamination, but that contamination is widespread and is systemic, turning just to the very narrow issue of contamination from produced water and flowback. This was addressed in Chapter 7 of your report. EPA identified 225 spills of flowback and produced water that reached environmental receptors, that is soil or surface water or groundwater. These spills totaled 1.6 million liters. So that's just pretty systemic and it's widespread. 225 spills just of the flowback and produced water all over the country. We see this. The second general observation is that EPA, this report acknowledges that there's actually a severe lack of data. We have a lot of information here, but there's also a lot of information that we don't have. And so I think that there's an obligation for regulators, for policymakers, and for the industry to require data collection, analysis, and publication of that data so the public knows what we're talking about. I want to turn to my specific consideration of charge question 5D, which you'll be considering later on this week. The conclusion here for me is that the science simply does not support the policy conclusion. There is a broad disconnect between what the science says and how the law, how the policy treats flowback and produced water. So Subtitle C of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, creates, as you probably know, a cradle-to-grave regulatory approach for the creation and the management and the ultimate disposal of hazardous waste. Now, flowback and produced water are categorically exempt from RCRA Subtitle C hazardous waste treatment. That determination was made in 1988, more than 25 years ago. You know, if you read your report, it was typed on a computer. If you read that determination, it was typed on a typewriter. You can tell from the fonts. It's fascinating. So what they said back in 1988, that is EPA, it is clear that some portions of both the large volume and associated waste would have to be treated as hazardous if the subtitle C exemption were lifted. So we know from a scientific perspective, we know that this is hazardous. It was only under economic considerations that the EPA back in 1988 determined that we should not consider this hazardous. Now, the study that is before you unequivocally concluded that much of it, or that at least some of this flowback and produced water would be hazardous waste. So I want to turn to, quoting from the report, evaluating the results of 3 different studies, this report generalizes, quote, elevated levels of barium is characteristic of Marcellus shale flowback and produced water. Characteristic, like it's typical that we have elevated levels of barium. How high is the barium? This is for the Hayes study. This is Hayes 2009, analyzed flowback from 3 West Virginia wells, 9 Pennsylvania wells. This study was conducted by the Marcellus Shale Coalition. That's an industry group. That's not an environmental group. They indicated median barium levels 5 times the statutory threshold. So typically, we're getting 5 times what should be hazardous waste. I'm going to conclude and refer you to my written comments. What we do is we just list a number of the studies that reach the same conclusion related to hazardous levels within the flowback and produced water. Ultimately, we believe that the figures speak for themselves, and the Scientific Advisory Board should conclude that hydraulic fracturing operations pollute drinking water resources, and they do so with hazardous contaminants.
Thank you, Mr. Mencius. Our next speaker is Mr. Kimball.
Yes, that's the water out of my well from my house. I'm Ray Kimball from Dimock, Pennsylvania. I'm an affected landowner and ex-gas worker. The water got contaminated up there by us. This is a pretest from the industry stating there was nothing wrong with the water in my house prior to gas drilling and fracking. This is the report from DEP showing over 27 chemicals now in the water. I like going in the back, uranium-238, 235, 236, uranium-234, 3 grades of thorium, 4 grades of lithium, strontium, manganese, aluminum. I mean, the list goes on of the levels that are ridiculous. Our lovely EPA came in, hand-delivered this document to me after they did their testing. I opened it up. And I turned around and I said, where's your scientific proof I want to see from our federal government? You give me a spreadsheet that my 5-year-old grandson could print up on a computer. It tells me nothing. They delivered this report to me on March 13th, 2012. We'll come back and explain it to you, right? Okay. They did. They came back March 20th with this report and hand-delivered it to me. Said, oh, this one's right, the first one's wrong, we need the first one back, here's the right one. Said, thank you, get off my property. They changed the levels of the test so it was no longer contaminated on my property. They came back and we all put our water from our houses, poured the water out from our faucets, and EPA refused to drink it after you sat there and turned around and told us our water was safe to drink and bathe in. Well, I challenge any of you to drink this water from my house right now. It's a bogus. I'm tired of being lied to. Y'all went national on the 22nd of July, said there was nothing wrong with the water in Dimock, Parker County, or Pavilion. Everything was just hunky-dory fine. Well, now why did you write me this report on July 23rd telling me my water's contaminated? This is from Regional 3, EPA, telling me my water's contaminated. I have a problem with EPA right now. Think you're all lying to me. Matter of fact, I know you're lying to me. I have reports from colleges, Duke's, Yale, everything else, showing diesel fuel and every other type of chemical in the water. The agents came back from EPA, off the record, Ray, don't drink the water, it's contaminated. I said, tell me something I don't know. This is a PowerPoint presentation those agents released to the LA Times showing the water's contaminated and that the test they did in Dimick is false. I'd love to know why, Dimick wasn't even put in this new study you did. I really have a problem with that. These are 3 consent orders done by our DEP and Cabinet Oil and Gas stating they contaminated the water in Dimick due to gas drilling and fracking. I still don't have water in my house. So this time here, I'm tired. I'm tired of being here. I'm going to hook this water back up in this house, and I want you to live in my house for the next week and using this water and see how you like it. I'm not here asking. I'm demanding EPA does their job and come back in and open these investigations up and tell us the truth. Because we have our own state says it's contaminated. The industry admits they polluted the water due to their gas drilling and fracking. I've been on frack sites and everything else. I worked it for 3 years. Believe me, some of the stuff you're hearing here, don't listen to the industry. Why don't you come up and see it for yourself and see the truth with your own eyes? It's a farce. Illegal dumping. Everything that we do. Cross-contamination of the trucks. Failed wheel concrete right from the get-go. We know it failed. And we still drill a hole. And we still put the well online. There's numerous problems I can't even get to because there's not enough time for me to do all this. All I want is you to come back and do your damn job and tell us the truth. And that's what I want. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kimball. Our next speaker is Mr. Payne.
Given the purpose of this panel, it seems appropriate and perhaps helpful to present my comments in the context of the charge questions. To that end, let me begin by stating that I was briefly engaged by Mr. Stephen Lipsky to undertake a review and investigation of the contamination that has affected the residential property that wells on his and neighboring properties in Parker County, Texas. I would like to offer comments related to a number of points in the charge questions, but for brevity, I will stay with charge question 1. The goal of the assessment was to review, analyze, and synthesize available data and information concerning the potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing. Are there topics that should be added to provide needed background for the assessment? Yes. To be concise, Henry's Law. The extent to which Henry's Law and its implications were ignored during sampling and data synthesis and interpretation in Southern Parker County case was astonishing to me. What was even more astonishing was realizing how widely Henry's Law is ignored in efforts to develop data on methane migration generally. At a basic and fundamentally important level, Henry's Law tells us that given a choice between being dissolved in water and being a free gas, methane will move into the gas phase. Further, methane is the epitome of a non-polar small molecule in water, the classical polar solvent. It follows that methane dissolved in water will rapidly exsolve whenever conditions permit. This all boils down to the simple realization that collecting a representative sample of water that contains any appreciable amount of methane represents a serious challenge, and the challenge becomes ever more difficult as the methane concentration increases. The open VOA vial sample collection method, often incorrectly referred to as EPA RSK 175, is widely used to collect water samples for methane analysis, including by environmental contractors for Range Resources and the Texas Railroad Commission, and is recommended by numerous other similar authorities in other states. Henry's Law tells us the use of any open vessel to sample for methane in water is probably not a great idea. Still, for many samples with commonly low methane levels, less than 1 or perhaps 2 parts per million, it is very convenient and provides reasonable results. The problem arises when one does not know if the methane levels are low at the time of sampling. In cases where methane migration and related groundwater contamination is possible, it should be assumed that methane concentration may be elevated and therefore the open VOA vial method is not appropriate. Conversations with EPA personnel confirm that EPA is aware there is a serious sampling methods problem. In the Southern Parker County case, samples collected by Range Resources contractors using open vials indicated methane concentration in the groundwater and samples in the area were no higher than 3 parts per million. Range and the Texas Railroad Commission concluded there was no contamination. However, this presented a bit of a dilemma in that the same well water would sustain a continuous flame and the water wellhead would vent continuously a flare over a meter in length, as it still does to this day. If only the relevant authorities had appreciated Henry's Law. Given the choice between a palpable real-world observation of combustible gas coming from the water and a sampling method that should be regarded by theoretical default as unreliable for contaminated wells, the authorities in Southern Parker County chose to go with the unreliable sampling method. As the case progressed, other entities and agents would sample in Southern Parker County using more reliable methods and always find methane in the 40 to 70 part per million range, fully in accord with Henry's Law and the direct observations of high concentrations of combustible gas. Routinely, by the way, over 85% combustible gas at the Lipsky water wellhead, with somewhat lower concentrations in numerous neighbors' wells. One might ask, what do such details in the Southern Parker County have to do with the EPA assessment report? Simply this. Many state authorities and industry laboratories, and indeed some standard methods publications, explicitly stipulate the open VOA vial sampling procedures to be used when sampling to determine methane in water. The Southern Parker County case clearly has shown that this standard sampling method provides no reliable indication of elevated levels of dissolved methane, even when those levels are very high. That is to say, then, dissolved methane that has been available from much of the previous literature, dissolved methane data that has been available from much of the previous literature, including scientific, industry, or government, especially state sources, probably is collected with the VOA sampling method and hence is at best unreliably informative on when or not methane contamination was or was not present in a given groundwater source. It follows then that the EPA assessment is attempting to discern contamination by looking at methane and water data from a method or related methods effectively blind to the contamination of concern. For the sake of brevity, I will now refer back to charge question 1. In my opinion, one cannot properly analyze data if one does not know the methods used to acquire that data. One cannot meaningfully synthesize data that does not reliably speak even to the presence or absence of contamination, let alone the level. There is much more to be gained from a thorough examination of the science in the Southern Parker County case, and among other things, Henry's Law implication in it.
Mr. Payne, your time's expired, sir. Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Hildenbrand.
Hello, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Dr. Zachariah Hildenbrand. I'm here representing Inform Environmental LLC and also the Collaborative Laboratories for Environmental Analysis and Remediation at the University of Texas at Arlington. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the research that my team has done over the past 5 years, trying to understand the relationship between unconventional drilling and environmental quality. When we're talking about unconventional drilling, we're talking about hydraulic fracturing, the stimulation process. We're also talking about shale acidization, which is using large quantities of volatile acids to dissolve rock and acquire hydrocarbons. And then we're also talking about the sequestration of these waste fluids in underground injection wells. The environmental concerns are numerous. They include concerns over air quality, human health, soil quality, groundwater surface quality, as a result of the use of large quantities of industrial fluids, chemicals, and then obviously the concern about gases. My team has done extensive research in the Eagle Ford Shale, illustrating that flaring stations, for example, are contributing to benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene isomers into the air, which are being concentrated into soils. However, I'm going to focus primarily on our latest groundwater research throughout the various shale formations in Texas. In 2011, we did a study which basically found as water wells got closer to gas wells that had been stimulated by hydraulic fracturing, that the concentrations of heavy metal ions increased significantly. We're referring to primarily arsenic, strontium, selenium, and barium. And in some cases, we found the levels of arsenic, which is a highly carcinogenic ion, to be 16 times above the EPA's safe drinking water standard. We followed up with a 2014 study where we collected 550 water well sites from either private water wells or from public water supply wells feeding small townships. And basically, what we found was quite shocking, actually. We screened the water for 15 different metal ions, anions, dissolved gases, and also 40 different volatile organic carbons. As you can see here, I have the analytes that we detected color-coded. We have the ones in red that were above their respective drinking water standards. Benzene was detected 34 times out of the 550 samples above the drinking water standard of 5 parts per billion. And we also found dichloromethane, which is an industrial cleaning agent, to be above the drinking water standard in 121 of the 550 samples. We also detected a number of different compounds, alcohols, chlorinated species, and again, organic solvents, some of which there are no regulated maximum contaminant limits, but again, we are finding these things in a parts per million range. Contaminants of particularly concern, benzene, trichloroethylene, dichloromethane, cyclohexane, and chloroform. These were found in a higher frequency in the counties where there is more unconventional drilling and hydraulic fracturing ongoing. In some cases, these chemicals were found exclusively in the Barnett Shale versus our samples that were collected as control sites outside of the Barnett Shale where there is no stimulation ongoing. As you can see, some of these constituents, benzene, for example, can trigger ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, can also trigger chronic myeloid leukemia. Some of these other things can trigger other blood-borne cancers and a series of other abnormalities and can have a deleterious effect on one's health. Interestingly, is these constituents that we found in the Barnett Shale are the same constituents that we found in our time series analysis in West Texas. We collected measurements before, during, and after the inception of unconventional drilling in this region, and it was only until after drilling had commenced that we were able to find these compounds, particularly dichloromethane and some of these other organic solvents, in the water. It was only after the drilling, and as the water was clean prior to drilling. All of this research has really pointed us into a subsequent time series analysis in Parker County, which I believe commands our undivided attention. In this region, we have found a large amount of volatile organic carbons in higher frequency than any other region that we've ever seen. We've seen explosive levels of gases in the water, which are vented off some of these wells and are also in the dissolved gas form. And we've also found that the dissolved gases in the water have a compositional and isotopic match to the gases being extracted from the nearby gas wells. So from my perspective, this is some of the most conclusive evidence that anyone has ever seen as to whether or not unconventional drilling has affected groundwater. And again, I believe it commands our undivided attention. As a result of this...
Your time's expired, Mr.
Okay.
Hildebrand. Dr. Hildebrand.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Fourpiece.
Mr. Chairman, members of the advisory panel, my name is Hope for Peace. I'm a producer with a nonprofit production company called AK Productions out of California. I have been studying the many cases of hydraulic fracturing contaminating water across the nation for the past 2 years. I've taken trips across the country to many of these sites and met many of the people that are here today talking about the larger cases, but I've also met many other people who would not come forward, who would not allow me to film them, and who will not speak about their water contamination. They live with it, and they pay for their own water because they're afraid to come out and to have to basically be called tree huggers, or if they work for industry, they can potentially lose their job. I also have spoken with many people who are under gag orders because they have gotten settlements with industry. So when the main talking point for the recent draft assessment is that the contamination cases are not widespread or systemic, I believe that we are leaving out a very large data set because there are actually on the ground hundreds of cases that we don't even know about. But we do know about many cases. We know in Pennsylvania that the DEP has found 243 cases. We know even in the neighborhoods that these good people represent in Parker County, in Dimock, Pennsylvania, and in Pavilion, that there are many, many cases on the ground. When Steve Lipsky first reported his case, he and one other landowner were the only cases that we knew about in that neighborhood. Now that's up to 10 cases. So we know that the potential is that this water contamination is widespread and systemic. From my perspective as a researcher, researching a film on this subject, it appears to me that what is widespread and systemic is the regulatory capture and the failure of our regulatory agencies to do their job. And the reason is that industry is giving you a lot of blowback, and we see that, and we understand and appreciate that. And it's very difficult to stand up against the gas and oil industry. They're very, very powerful. And that is why these investigations have been ended in Parker County, Pavilion, and Dimock. And it's a difficult thing to watch as an American, this kind of cover-up, this level of cover-up. So when the draft assessment came out, I did approach the EPA and ask why these cases were not included. And the answer was, we're only looking for the potential. What tells you about the potential more than hundreds of cases on the ground? And yet when we go in and look at these cases, you know, the gas and oil industry and the politicians and the political pushback is just way too much for us to even deal with. And because of that, the cover-up is allowing absolutely terrible science to inform us. For instance, everyone here would appreciate that if this bottle, we know that it has 50% methane gas in it, and the lid is on. If I take the lid off, what are the chances that you're going to have a reading of 0 methane at the hole? Virtually none. It's almost impossible. But those are the findings and the readings that were used in Steve Lipsky's case in Parker County. The Railroad Commission is part of this massive cover-up, and they have allowed testing to be used. The only testing that was used in Steve Lipsky's case for that hearing for the Railroad Commission was specious. They had photographs showing the water on fire. They ignored them. That would tell you that the parts per million was at least 28 parts per million, and they allowed range to turn in testing that said 2.3 parts per million. They allowed ambient air testing that had 0 methane, 0 ethane, and some small parts of propane. That's only possible if you're testing at a barbecue store and you're testing, propane tanks. But this testing was allowed to stand, to allow range resources to be found innocent, and year after year, Republican politicians go in front of Congress and testify about how Parker County is a great example of EPA's terrible science. By not including these cases, especially Parker County, Pavilion, and Dimock, we are disallowing a data set that's going to give you a very different result than not widespread and systemic. We are planning to have 1 million gas wells across this country to support the global LNG industry. And the impacts on our national water could be absolutely catastrophic, and we are not looking at it. And I'm asking you to be tough, be strong, stand down the political power that is trying to stop this, because it's our nation's water that is at stake, and people's lives are being ruined. And these people are at the edge of their ability to deal with this, as you would be if you were in this situation.
Your time has expired.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Lipsky.
My name is Steve Lipsky. Again, I'm going to talk fast. 5 years and 5 minutes is difficult. Here basically you see a picture of when it all started. My well was drilled in 2005, my water well. September 2009, Range Resources drilled approximately underneath my house, about a mile down, but we noticed problems, and then actually we thought our well went dry. PEX Well Service came out, took this picture and said it's gas locking, and this is where it started. called everyone, found out the Railroad Commission was responsible for coming out. Railroad Commission, the range resources, these were actually pictures here of my water on fire and the vent on fire. The vent's always open. These are all pictures. That's a water truck delivering my water. These are pictures over the last 5 years. They're actually in date order, so you can see it's like Old Faithful. Water lights, vent lights every time. Anyone's more than welcome to come out and view it for themselves, because they call it a hoax. Range Resources, basically when they did their testing in 2011, you can see on here, they said the results showed that my water is safe to drink and there's no danger in my home. But if you look at page 2 here, they say that in my headspace, that's a foot down, 2 feet down from the vent, that they also claim has a 0 rating, has almost 500,000 parts per million of methane. That's 10 times explosive limits. Like again, going back to Henry's Law, that's impossible. Their math doesn't add up. Second of all, again, another letter from them basically going to my attorney saying that water well is safe and I can use it. Again, in the Railroad Commission hearing, they also talk about faults. The gray area is my area. They said there's absolutely no faults in my area. This documentation all here is decades before they drilled. I have other evidence another company left the area because of the faults and would not even drill. In 2014, this is the Railroad Commission came back in again. This is the company who did the testing for them. If you see here, I zoomed in, and it says that one of the reasons they did this test the way they did it is because my water well was significantly effervescent to use this method. Okay, we all know that effervescing means it is, if you look on here, dissolved methane, this is actually from the OSGS, that it has reached saturation. Reaching saturation, again, means it has to be a minimum of 28 milligrams per liter, and this is, again, the same point that will light on fire, and this is a point also that you need, again, you have some, basically some serious risk here, which we know my water, again, has to be at least over 28. We have done testing with Duke Universities and Isotech, which ranges anywhere between 50 and 70. Some of the highest readings they ever got in any residential well. This actually here is, again, from the Railroad Commission. This is Barry Smitherin, given to Congress in June 6, 2012, saying that I attempted to extort $6.5 million from Range. Again, this is another one from David Porter in 2014, saying everything Mr. Lipsky is completely fraudulent stunts. Okay, testimony that they're giving, and no one's saying anything about it. And what I want to get to next is the OIG report. Basically, what they have here is they're saying that Region 6, they had a reason to issue the emergency order because it was real and they felt Range did it. But they also had a reason to withdraw it, and that is that number one, that they couldn't, the cost factor. They couldn't take on the industry. How can I? Two is they reduce it because they're saying basically I hooked up my own water supply so I was no longer at risk. 3 is Range Producers agreed to participate in a study, which they didn't. And 4 is they agreed to test 20 water wells in Parker County for 3 months, all but mine. No testing of mine afterwards. Again, at this point, I'm done. I don't know what to do. I feel that the EPA abandoned me. I'm being sued by Range Resources for saying that they did it. Well, I thought they did. I was told by my government they did. And at this point, I'm being called a hoax, a liar, and that my water is safe. And the EPA has not come back and confirmed that if they're correct or not. At this point, I have no choice. I'm not crazy. I am going to go ahead December 1st and hook the water back up to my house. I feel that either the EPA will have to legally, if they feel there is a problem, step in and do something about it. If they don't, that tells me that they feel that they did make a mistake when they issued this emergency order, and the industry and the Road Commission is correct. And again, I just want to move on with my life. I don't want to come here again. I don't want to be here today. This has ruined my life for the last 5 years. It ruins my family's life. And again, I just want to move on. I don't want to ever come back here again. And again, I just like to get this over with. And if my water's safe, then we'll move on and we'll see what happens. If it's not, I'll do what I can to protect my family. But Range Research, the EPA, again, if they think there's something wrong with the water, they need to step forward and do something about it. And again, if not, they need to apologize to me, the Railroad Commission, and Range Resources for letting this all start in the first place. Again, I'm being paid to say my water does not light on fire. Anyone can come down at any time, it does. And actually here, I'll show you one thing I forgot to show you. This is just taken 4 days ago. This is actually video footage of a water jug of my water they're just putting in. And this would be the same thing if I believe it would be in my shower, because I have a small shower with the door closed. This is just the water lighting on fire. This is, it's not a hoax. you can come and see it. I know
Thank
my
you,
time
Mr.
is up.
Your time has
And
expired,
again, you can
Mr.
see this
Lipsky.
here, but thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr.
Hope to
Lipsky.
never be here again.
Our next speaker is Mr. Fenton.
John Fenton, Pavilion, Wyoming. I have very mixed emotions about everything that goes on with this, and one of the biggest things for us is that we tried for years and years and years to get the state of Wyoming to come and listen to the problems that we were having, and we're constantly met by excuses of not having money or manpower or scientific knowledge. So therefore, when we actually got EPA to come in and agree to do a groundwater study, we were very excited that we got some knowledge and some people that were trained to specifically look at the issues that we were dealing with. We had people come and actually do data collection. They actually came and did their jobs. And it was amazing to see the process in action, that we felt like we were being represented finally. Now, when conclusions come out that are controversial or that the powers that be don't agree with, it causes problems, and that's exactly what happened with us. When the EPA came forth with data stating that we did have reasons to be concerned about the water in our area and that it could be potentially from hydraulic fracturing, the boom was lowered on us. The state of Wyoming and the oil and gas industry went to war with the Environmental Protection Agency and with the people who live there, and the EPA folded. It wasn't the EPA out of Region 8, the people who had done all the work. It was directly from the Obama administration. And we were left in the hands of a state-run investigation that admittedly by Governor Matt Mead was being funded by Encana Oil and Gas. Included this in my evidence that I presented on the record, which now potentially makes it illegal for us to even collect data on public property. When in this country did the people charged with looking after the citizens and the well-being of everyone be emasculated by a company whose job it is to make a profit? Why are we left in the hands of the people who caused our problem? Why, in this investigation, was there not more of scientists on the ground doing what scientists do, collecting data? I quite frankly, if I hear frack focus one more time, I think I will become physically ill. It's a website that reports chemicals that everybody knows, the basic chemicals, the rest are exempt. How can we sit here and say that a whole industry that is exempt from our major regulatory statutes to protect the environment can possibly do anything safe? If it was safe, they wouldn't need to be exempt from the rules. I really encourage you to do more than review industry's data. This has to be an on-the-ground study. In the meantime, think of all the hundreds and thousands of people that live with this every day. Within 4-mile radius of our home, we have 200 fracked wells. This is not just new wells, and the state of Wyoming has a long history of oil and gas production. They're fracking old infrastructure. It's not just horizontal shale wells. It's coal bed methane. It's vertical tight sands. There's all these things that just don't seem to matter. And quite frankly, I'm tired of being here too. I always wanted to bring my children to Washington, D.C. and show them around and give them an idea of what this country was founded on. And quite frankly, that's the last thing I want to do now. I've completely lost faith in the system. This has to be more inclusive with the people who are directly impacted, not just the people who are making profit from this.
Thank you, Mr. Fenton. Our next speaker is Mr. Davis. If Mr. Davis is not here, our next speaker is Mr. Stevens.
If you didn't catch a glimpse of that earlier from everybody, there's raised water again. Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by reminding you all of the U.S. EPA mission statement. The mission of EPA is to protect human health and the environment. All Americans are protected from significant risk to human health and the environment where they live, learn, and work. National efforts to reduce environmental risk are based on best scientific information. Federal laws protecting human health and the environment are enforced fairly, effectively. Fail, 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 and fail. My name is Craig Stevens, and I'm a sixth-generation landowner in Silver Lake Township, Pennsylvania. I'm here to discuss the EPA study on hydrofracking that has been 5 years coming. Cannot convey how disappointed I was that the EPA chose to tell the world in your press release hydraulic fracturing activities in the U.S. are carried out in a way that have not led to widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources. Are you promoting or regulating this industry? I would ask this body of science professionals, what is your definition of widespread or systemic? The population of Susquehanna County is 45,000 people, and to put it in context, an epidemic is 1 in 1,000, or 45 cases out of 45,000. And a pandemic is 1 in 100, or 450 cases out of 45,000. In Endemic Pennsylvania, 33 water wells were contaminated in one single day. I have documentation from our own Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection that shows hundreds of cases of water contamination determined after full investigation that states quite clearly the cause. Your private water well has been found to be contaminated by natural gas drilling in your area. These documents represent all 33 drilling counties in the Commonwealth. When the EPA spent 6 months endemic from January 2012 to June 2012 testing water, they had a chance to tell the world the truth. But sadly, it was politics as usual. The EPA's own agents made it clear that the water was poisoned, and the investigation was initiated because the ATSDR found some alarming water test results data there. I have reviewed the EPA budget history for the past 46 years, and from 2008 to 2015, your budget was $8 to $10 billion a year with a workforce of 15 to 17,000 employees. The American public looks at this kind of investment in the largest regulatory agent on earth as a huge financial drain that is only worthwhile if you do your jobs and protect us. We, the people, are considering your oversight of this practice a failure, and the practice leaving us at the mercy of the individual state governments has been an abject failure. I am the son of a 63-year emergency first responder. My father had a saying, when you mix politics with health and safety, nobody survives. Stop playing politics with us. We don't need another misleading study. We need action from the EPA. In our communities, we are suffering horribly because of you refusing to do your jobs. My water began tasting like metal in March of 2013, and after 2 weeks I started having spontaneous nosebleeds, 8 over 2 weeks. They stopped when I ceased drinking my water. I called Pennsylvania Department of Health, and they had me call Pennsylvania DOH, who took my name and number 5 times over 2 weeks, but failed to return a call as promised. This is unacceptable. In Pennsylvania, they started with 1,000-foot presumed liability. Then in 2012, they increased it to 2,500 feet. But when you asked to show the scientific basis for these distances, there was none. We're not interested in being a part of this public health experiment. I asked this body to come and see it, come and drink it, and come and breathe it, and tour the affected area. We've had thousands of people come and tour our area over 6 years from all over the world to evaluate it themselves. We are sharing the devastation, with others as they will not continue to allow our community to be sacrificed for the oil and gas industry. I ask you to look at the oil and gas industry's financial situation. They're in massive debt and are on the verge of collapse, laying off workers. Who do you think is going to be stuck cleaning up this mess? It is health that is real wealth, not pieces of gold and silver. Gandhi. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing. Sir Edmund Burke. Please use the science including your own agency's investigations in the 3 communities across the country where water was contaminated, and share the truth, what is going on in this industry across the country. Then EPA will be doing its job. Last thing I'll say, Martin Luther King, on some positions, cowardice asked the question, is it safe? Expediency asked the question, is it politic? Vanity asked the question, is it popular? But conscience asked the question, is it right? This is not right, you all know it, and we're tired of generational suicide. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Our next speaker is Mr. Goa.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Listening to all these stories, this is 10 years of my life. It's been like being in a war zone, thanks to range resources in the oil and gas industry. I worked in the oil and gas industry for approximately 7 years. I'm not an expert, but I'm not stupid. The stories you're hearing today, they're not anecdotal. It's not hysteria, these key words that the industry likes to use. My testimony that you have in your hands is too long for me to read. But I'm going to invite you like I invite everybody. Come and see. And I'll introduce you to people that are sick. I'll introduce you to people that their water wells are contaminated. I watched my 2.5 acre pond turn black. Industry said they didn't do it. The DEP said it was either copper sulfate or a herbicide. He had absolutely no evidence, and this was the press secretary for the DEP back in '06. And by the way, I received an email about 8 months later. The fellow was out on bail of $250,000 bond because he was filming a 8-year-old and 9-year-old girl. This is what we're dealing with. People need to wake up. You see these cattle? I know it's too hard, it's too far away. These are dead cattle. You know how many people that have lost cattle and have not been compensated? Do you know how many people are buying water where they had perfectly good water? My neighbors, who I went to their houses on a regular basis, drank their water. After they drilled and fracked my wells, they had gas migration, guaranteed. I had water bubbling outside the casing on Gula number 6, and it's a vertical well. I had that water tested by Bear Corporation, an individual that I got to know. What did we have in it? And this is outside the well casing, gentlemen, and this is approximately about 150 foot, I'd say 150 to 175 foot elevation drop from the top of the pad to the top of the pond water. And my pond turned black again, killed all the vegetation. Well, anyway, the water's bubbling outside the casing. We tested it. All the B-Texes. Benzene, toluene, xylene, MP xylene, XP xylene, through the roof. Well, if it's outside the casing, where else is it? We also had water tested, me and another person, and we knew it would never hold up in court because of the chain of custody, but we did it anyway because I knew there were problems here because of my background. And every question I asked the industry, I knew the answer to most of the questions. I wanted to see their response. It was a lie. A complete lie. I'm like, what is going on? And again, I was a second test well in Pennsylvania. We were supposed to have vertical wells on the lease, dry gas, 350,000 cubic feet of gas free a year. That was the hook that hooked everybody. This was not about money. We got $7.50 an acre. I wanted the free gas because I was going to build a new house. I had Dr. Pools. Here's his card, which I'm sure you're familiar with him. He came to Washington County. I rented a library, our citizens' library, from 3 o'clock until 8 o'clock that evening. I had people coming in with their water results. I had him to a couple different farms early on. I showed him pictures of the dead cattle, and he's just looking at them, shaking his head. He stated at the end of that meeting, folks, I have heard the same scenario in every state that I have been in. Then he started naming the states: Colorado, Texas, Arkansas. I've heard the stories of the people being sick, the people losing livestock, the water wells being contaminated, or springs. It's the same scenario. And then he stated, this warrants enough of evidence today that warrants us to come in to investigate. First year goes by, nothing. The second year goes by, nothing. Just what, 2 months ago you released the study? Folks, I'm going to tell you right here and right now, I've had it to here. I'm ready to die because you've pushed me too far. And Range has pushed me too far. Lawyers have destroyed my case. I'm with my third law firm.
Mr. Gola, your time's expired.
Do your job, folks.
Thank you, Mr. Gola. Our next speaker, and I think this will be the last speaker before we break for lunch, is Mr. McMillan.
Good morning. My name is Hugh McMillan. I'm pleased to be here to observe this process. I'm an applied mathematician and computational scientist. I'm well versed in the methods employed to model the very simplistic contamination scenarios considered in the assessment, and look forward to that discussion tomorrow. After serving as a AAAS Congressional Fellow in the U.S. Senate, I joined Food and Water Watch as a senior researcher. I'm concerned about the integrity of this process, and I believe you as scientific advisors should be as well. As you must be aware, current U.S. energy policy effectively equates widespread fracking with energy security in this country. This is in lockstep with the interests of both the oil and gas industry and the investment banks that own the fracking industry's debt. There's no doubt that this alignment of policy considerations has shaped the assessment. Certainly it's telling that the EPA abandoned its investigations in Dimmick, Pavilion, and Parker County, that it excluded these cases of contamination from the assessment, and that it refers to the impacts people have suffered, as you've heard today. It refers to these impacts as vulnerabilities, as if the harms were just hypothetical and not being lived every day by thousands. To those who've been harmed, this is very insulting. And any assessment ought to include these cases of contamination, specifically in Dimmick, Pavilion, and Parker County. The EPA's reliance on the voluntary cooperation of industry for access to data and well sites is likewise telling, and it's likewise shaped the science in the assessment. The fact that untold numbers of cases are hidden in sealed court settlements have further shaped the science. In their 2008 book, Bending Science, How Special Interests Corrupt Public Health Research, legal scholars Thomas McGarity and Wendy Wagner wrote the following: the most important thing upper level policymakers can do to prevent public misunderstanding of their attempts to incorporate scientific advice into the decision-making process is to be candid about the extent to which their final decisions rest on science and the extent to which policy considerations fill the gaps left by the scientific uncertainties. I believe by this measure the final draft assessment does the public a disservice, and nothing embodies this more than the employment of the phrase widespread systemic impacts, as you've heard other speakers say this morning. This phrase is proven contentious precisely because it papers over the gaps left by the scientific uncertainties in the assessment. These scientific uncertainties and inherent limitations are made quite clear in the assessment. The phrase was employed as somewhat of a threshold, right? It's a multi-dimensional threshold for each of the dimensions of impacts that have been identified, and it's beyond this threshold. Concern would presumably otherwise be triggered, and yet this phrase is meaningless. It's only defined implicitly as being above and beyond existing levels of damage. And this is done, one can only imagine, in order to dismiss this damage as nothing but collateral damage. As it stands, the result of the agency's artifice with this phrase is that oil and gas corporations and big banks succeed in projecting their vision for the future, and that is decades more drilling and fracking to extract as much unconventional oil and gas as possible. Not only will this mean more spills and leaky wells that compromise drinking water resources, more air pollution, more problems for landowners affected, but it will also continue to destabilize the climate on which we all depend. And I believe as drafted, the assessment paves the way for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McMillan. I'm informed that Mr. Dufala is not here. That leaves us with two speakers, so I think we'll go ahead and do these two speakers, and that'll push us a bit past noon, but that's okay. And our next speaker then is Mr. Moyer. Mr. Moyer not here? Oh, I'm sorry.
Their lack of attention to stand. It's so bad and it's so sad. It hurts. This is a real serious situation.
Halliburton that's trying to train all these kids for, in the schools around here. Go up and get a gas job. Do you need kicked in the head or what? Wake up, hello, come in. That's not a job. That's a death camp.
Randy Morris had his own trucking company, but when gas prices went up, he was nearly out of business. He started driving for the oil and gas industry, having no idea what kind of chemicals he was handling or what they could do to his health.
I can go from here and think of something. By the time if someone would yell at me, I forgot where I'm going, what I'm doing. It's that crazy what this stuff does. It just destroys you. I worked them 3 days up on the well pad, and I come home and I went in the emergency room because it got so bad that they kept me in there all weekend. Well, this stuff here, see, these would creep up in you. That's like someone sticking gasoline on you. And these things welt out anywhere from 1/8 to 1/4 inch. That stayed on me 14, 15 months straight.
Now, the one night that he came down from upstairs, he's going, I thought, what were you drinking up there? Oil, water, or what? And he said, Mama, he can't talk. His tongue was so swollen. I had to call the ambulance.
I stuck a spoon in there.
Oh, my God.
Your tongue was so big that
oh, my God, I thought he was going to die.
4 times like that. Fresh water, dirty water. The guys that are driving, this is in their head. You're hauling dirty water. Do you see anything about a chemical? Do you see one thing on that page about a chemical? That goes to show you right there. Not a one of them trucks shows these drivers knows anything than haul fresh or dirty water. We call it mud.
Here's something.
These are just some of the different companies. You get your status like this through stickers. Snake sticker where you weren't allowed to run over any rattlesnakes. That was a test. You had to go through rattlesnake training. I ain't kidding.
Rattlesnake training, but no chemical training.
No. The mats are around the wellhead like dominoes, I guess, and you put them together, and the trucks run up on them. Well, they got little corrugated, some got clover leaves, some got diamonds, but they're about a quarter-inch deep. And just enough of that 12 by 8 sheet holding that material will get you sick as hell. My job was to go in there with a hand squeegee. I'd put my truck in the center there with my hose and put it on vac, and it'd suck all that mud and everything up. I had waterproof work boots on. That stuff ate the waterproofing off of it, soaked through the boots, then my feet and my socks were soaking wet. I went in and took my boots off, and the heater, we put them on the floor so it blows up to heat the floor. Man, I about went through that truck roof. My feet were red, and as soon as that heat, it felt like someone lit me on fire. I mean, just burning, itching. It was driving me stinking nuts that night. But you still got to do your job, because you ain't got no way to call anybody. There's no emergency, nothing around you. So you just deal with it. Workers are turning over like somebody flipping pancakes. This one will quit, they got another one lined up. That one will quit, they got another one lined up. There's guys on there 2 and 3 years that never had a safety meeting about this stuff. And how does people get away with it? You know what really baffles me? These idiots still put this stuff on TV. It's the cleanest fuel. Are you out of your mind? It's people insane.
What do you feel like when you hear the governor of Pennsylvania or President Obama talk about the jobs in the natural gas?
Yeah, there's jobs. Your job, once you get this stuff, you know what your job is? Looking for doctors.
One time, this was the sickest time he ever had that I saw him. He was laying on the bed. He could hardly get up. A baby crying, that's how he sounded. Just saying, ow, kind of.
Tell him what it felt like when you put your hand on me.
Yeah, he always feels like just touching a lighter. It just feels like that. Yeah.
Like touching a lighter. It felt like touching a lighter. Still feels like touching a lighter. Where I go, he goes. You can ask him.
If he goes upstairs, I go upstairs. If he goes downstairs, I go downstairs. If he goes outside, I go outside. Gets in the car, I go in the car.
My mini-me. But what has this done to him? Look what it took off of him. I'm bad enough, but look what it took from him.
Take you. Put it in your life.
Yeah, but it's taking me, buddy. You'll lose all your senses, your smell, your taste. You'll taste metal on your tongue all the time. Then you get this spinning all the time. He used to ride my shoulders everywhere. I'd carry fishing rods and tackle boxes, and he'd ride on my shoulder. We'd go down through the woods to a fishing hole. Ask him the last time he's been on my shoulders. I can't do it no more. It destroyed my health. Destroyed me. Totally destroyed.
Can you go back to driving your truck?
I can't go back to doing anything. I'm lucky I can get this boy fishing.
And you have a long-term plan for...
Yeah, spend as much time and having as many memories as I can give him.
There was a plan that, if it had been implemented, would have created millions of jobs in the United States that were green jobs. This Congress has just stopped all progress. So we have now...
Okay. And our last speaker is Mr. Larson from NRDC.
Good morning. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I also want to thank EPA for organizing the Science Advisory Board and allowing public input into this issue. My name is Dr. Lance Larson. I'm a postdoctoral fellow representing the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC. NRDC is a nonprofit advocacy organization comprised of roughly 2 million members and online activists whose objective is to safeguard the earth, its people, its plants, and natural systems with all life depends. Prior to my postdoc position at the NRDC, I earned a PhD in environmental engineering and biogeochemistry, where I published multiple peer-reviewed publications and presented research at domestic and international geochemistry journals, or conferences, excuse me. The first point I wanted to make today has been raised by many others here. In NRDC and Clean Water Action's written comments to EPA, we raised significant issues with the conclusions drawn in EPA's assessment. Specifically, EPA reports, and I quote, "We did not find evidence of these mechanisms have led to widespread systemic impacts on water resources in the United States. However, EPA has not clearly defined or quantified what would constitute a widespread or systemic impact, nor has EPA attempted to justify how the underlying data analysis could support such a conclusion. To define an impact, we would have to observe a change from the base state or baseline condition. Baseline hasn't been adequately defined in this report, nor has the change been defined and quantified as well. This is similar to the proverbial one-armed fisherman. He caught a fish that was this big, right? So the fallacy that EPA, this document, is falling into a similar sort of category. As reviewers for journals, when manuscripts, conclusions, and abstracts are not supported by the data, the manuscript is rejected or sent back to the author for revisions, either minor or major. We've all gone through this process, and I assume that you've gone through it as well, either by sending an article back or by being on the end where you had to complete minor or major revisions. Hopefully there was little rejection. Similarly, NRDC recommends that EPA clarify, modify, or remove these conclusory statements based upon the available data. Closely related to my first point, there's a sizable data gap regarding our understanding of the spatial and temporal impacts to water quantity and quality. EPA's assessment inadequately accounts for long-term impacts to groundwater supplies. The transport of contaminants, especially in groundwater, is extremely complex and could take decades to impact potential sources of water. This becomes further complicated with the potential impacts due to water supplies due to failed well casings. We recommend that EPA invest significant resources into future research, monitoring, data collection, and modeling, which could fill in these knowledge gaps. Furthermore, a yearly update or amended assessment could provide and improve the knowledge and potential issues as they become available. In summary, NRDC interprets the findings in EPA's assessments to confirm that hydraulic fracturing activities pose a range of risks to human health and to an unknown quantity of surface and groundwater supplies. We encourage EPA through the SAB to continue to fill in the gaps of data and to quantify and adequately assess these risks, both now and for the future. Thank you for your time today, and that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Before we break for lunch, I'd ask the panel members if there are any clarifying questions to any of the speakers from whom we've heard this morning. You care to raise at this time? Okay, seeing none, then we will adjourn and we will reconvene at 1:15 p.m. And for the panel members, lunch.
It's over here on the first floor.